Lucian Crowell didn't knock. He rode through Callum Rourke's gate like he already owned the ground beneath his horse's hooves. 3 men fanned out behind him, and he pulled up close enough that the animal's breath hit Callum's face before Callum even had time to set down his hammer. "Sign it," Crowell said, and held out a folded paper with 2 fingers like he was feeding scraps to a dog. Callum looked at the paper. He looked at the 3 men. He looked back at Crowell. "I don't recall inviting you onto my land." Crowell smiled the way men smile when they've already decided how something ends. "Mr. Vane is being generous. That won't last." Callum set the hammer down on the fence post, slow and deliberate. "Then tell Mr. Vane to stop wasting his generosity on me." Crowell's smile didn't move. "Wrong answer, Cowboy." If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is just getting started. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Callum Rourke had owned Cinder Creek Ranch for 11 days when he understood that owning something and keeping it were 2 entirely different problems. He'd bought the place in October of 1889 in Holt County, Montana, from a man named Deakins who'd broken 2 fingers on his right hand and 3 more on his left trying to make the land work, and finally decided it wasn't worth the arithmetic. The price was low enough that Callum could manage it after 15 years of wages saved in a tobacco tin under whatever bunk he happened to be sleeping in. Low enough that he had money left after the sale closed. Not much, but enough for 1 winter's supplies if he was careful. And Callum had been careful with money since he was old enough to understand what it was for. The ranch was 240 acres. On paper, that sounded like something. On foot, it looked like a long argument with gravity. The barn leaned northeast at an angle that suggested it was attempting to lie down. The south fence had collapsed entirely in 3 places and stood barely upright in 6 more. The well produced water the color of weak tea and about half the volume it should have, which Callum suspected had something to do with the collapsed stone lining he could see from the lip if he leaned in far enough. The ranch house itself was structurally sound, that much he could say, but sound in the way a man with a broken arm is technically alive. It needed windows recaulked, 2 sections of roof reshingled, and a front door that didn't require a shoulder to convince it open. He knew all of this before he bought it. He'd stood on that same porch 11 days ago and looked at every broken thing on the property and made his calculations and signed the paper anyway. Because the land itself was different. Below the barn and the failing fences and the tea-colored well, Cinder Creek cut through a 1/4 mile of valley floor, and the grass that grew along both banks was the kind of grass cattle would walk a long way to reach. The eastern pasture, if it could be reclaimed and fenced properly, would carry a good-sized herd through spring and summer without supplemental feed. The soil along the creek bottom was dark and held moisture even in dry years, which in Montana was the difference between surviving and not. Callum had ridden every inch of it twice before making his offer. He'd tasted the creek water. He dug his boot heel into the pasture soil and turned it up and examined what the roots looked like. He'd watched which direction the morning light fell and figured the angle of the valley walls and concluded that the eastern side would stay protected from the worst of the northern wind. He knew what the place was worth, not what Deakins was asking, what it was actually worth, assuming a man put 15 or 20 years of consistent labor into it and didn't do anything stupid. That was the part nobody else had seen. Or if they'd seen it, they'd looked at the broken barn and the collapsed fence and decided the distance between what the place was and what it could be was too far to travel in one man's lifetime. Callum figured that was probably true if you were in a hurry. He wasn't. He'd spent 15 years working other men's ranches in Wyoming and Montana, and once for 8 months in Colorado, and what he'd learned about himself in that time was that he was not a man who required comfort to function. He required purpose. He required the particular satisfaction of going to sleep, knowing that something was better than it had been when he woke up that morning. He could not get that from a bunk in another man's barn. So he bought Cinder Creek with nearly everything he had and accepted that the first winter would be the hardest, and he was well into proving himself right on that count when Horace Vane's attorneys started appearing at his gate. The first one came 6 days after Callum moved in, a thin young man in a coat that hadn't been designed for Montana weather, who handed Callum a letter sealed with wax and explained in a voice clearly intended to sound like he delivered this kind of news routinely, that Mr. Horace Vane of the Vane Cattle Company wished to make an offer on the Cinder Creek property. Callum read the number. It was twice what he'd paid. "Tell him no," Callum said, and handed the letter back. The young attorney blinked. He'd clearly not prepared remarks for that response. "Sir, this offer represents..." Tell him no, Callum said again, and don't come back unless the answer's going to change, which it isn't. The attorney left. The offer came back 4 days later, through a different man, higher by another quarter. Callum said no again, which brought him to the morning 11 days in when Lucian Crowell rode through his gate with 3 men at his back and a paper extended between 2 fingers. Callum had heard of Crowell before he ever owned land that interested Horace Vane. Most men who worked cattle in Holt County had. Crowell had been Vane's chief attorney for going on 12 years, which meant he had been the instrument of every foreclosure, every boundary dispute, every contract that came out in Vane's favor and left the other man wondering how it had happened. He was not large and he was not loud. How was the kind of thin-faced, patient man who made you feel the ground shifting under your feet before you understood he'd moved it? "What is this?" Callum said. He hadn't reached for the paper. "A revised offer," Crowell said. "More than fair. I told the last man and the man before him that I'm not selling." "You told them." Crowell folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "You haven't told me. I like to handle these things personally when they've become complicated." "Nothing's complicated. I own this land and I'm keeping it." One of the 3 men behind Crowell shifted in his saddle, and Callum noted the shift without looking directly at it. He kept his eyes on Crowell's face where the information was. "Mr. Vane has substantial holdings along every boundary of your property," Crowell said. "Water access, grazing rights, road easements. A man in your position trying to establish something from nothing." He paused to let the phrase land the way he'd meant it. "Depends on neighbors who are cooperative. I'll manage. Will you?" Crowell looked past him at the leaning barn. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. "Get off my land," Callum said. The 2 men stared at each other across 10 feet of cold Montana morning. Then Crowell touched his hat brim with one finger, turned his horse, and rode back out the gate with his 3 men following. Callum watched them go. He picked up his hammer. He drove the next nail into the fence post and didn't stop until the section was finished. But his hands, when he looked at them that evening, were less steady than they'd been in the morning. I was working the south fence 3 days later when the rider appeared on the ridge road. He noticed her because she was riding alone, which was unusual, and because she was riding well, which was unusual in a different direction. Most people who came to Cinder Creek from the ridge road were either Vane's people in groups or lost travelers who'd taken the wrong branch at the creek crossing. This woman rode like she knew exactly where she was going and had no particular interest in whether anyone was watching her get there. She came through the gate without stopping, rode directly toward where Callum was working on the fence. She was maybe 27, 28, with dark hair pulled back under a hat that wasn't ornamental, wearing a coat that was good quality but worn at the elbows. She sat her horse with the kind of unconscious ease that meant she'd been doing it since before she could reason about it. "You're Rourke," she said. "I am." "I'm Rosalind Vane." Callum straightened from the fence post. He looked at her without saying anything for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something that matched the name Vane as he understood it, which was substantial and polished and aware of its own weight. She looked at him without any of the performance that money usually carried with it. "Mr. Vane's daughter," he said. "His only child, yes." She looked at the fence section he'd been repairing. "You're doing that corner wrong." Callum looked at the corner. "Excuse me?" "The brace configuration. The way you've set that diagonal, the pressure will transfer upward when the post settles and it'll pull the whole corner loose inside a year." She wasn't saying it to be unpleasant. She was saying it the way you tell a stranger they have mud on their coat. Informational. You want the diagonal running the other direction, driving force down into the ground instead of up. Callum looked at the corner post. He looked back at her. "I came to talk about my father's offer," she said. "There's nothing to talk about." "I disagree." She swung down from the horse, ground hitched it with a practiced drop of the reins, and walked toward the fence like she'd done it 1,000 times, which she probably had. "The number on the current offer is higher than this property's assessed value by a considerable amount. Most men in your situation would have taken it already. Most men in my situation didn't spend 15 years saving to buy it." She stopped near the corner post and examined it. "How long have you been running cattle?" "Since I was 19. "Where?" "Wyoming mostly. Some Montana, 8 months in Colorado." "Who did you work for in Wyoming?" he told her. She nodded at 2 of the names in a way that said she knew them or knew their operations. "My father wants this property," she said. "He wants the creek access and the eastern acreage to extend his grazing rotation. He's been patient about it, which isn't characteristic of him, which means he wants it considerably." "I understand what he wants." "Then you understand he's going to keep trying." "I do." and that doesn't concern you." "What concerns me," Callum said, "is getting this fence line finished before the ground freezes. Everything else is noise." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment, then she looked back at the corner post. "I wasn't joking about the brace," she said. "I heard you. You going to fix it? I'm going to think about it." She made a sound that might have been almost a laugh. She walked back to her horse, put a foot in the stirrup, and swung up in one motion. "My father's going to send Crowell again," she said, gathering the reins. "He already has." Something shifted in her expression. Small, but there. "And?" "Same answer as before." She held his gaze for another second. Then she turned the horse and rode back out the gate the same way she'd entered, straight and certain, like she'd already filed away everything she needed. Callum stood in the cold for a while after she was gone. Then he walked back to the corner post and crouched down and looked at the brace configuration. He looked at it for a long time. The next morning, before he started on anything else, he pulled the brace and reset it the way she'd described. She came back 2 days later. He was at the well doing calculations on paper about what it would cost to have the lining repaired versus attempting it himself with materials from town. She rode up and dismounted and walked over and looked at the problem the same way she'd looked at the fence corner, assessing, not decorating. "What's your timeline for the well?" she said. "Need it producing properly before December, February at the outside. The collapse at the lining? 4 feet down, maybe 5. Stones have shifted. You'll need to pull them out to the break and reset from there. Have you done that before?" "Not on a well this configuration." "I have." She said it without weight. "My father's South Range property had 2 of them fail the same way. I oversaw both repairs." Callum folded his paper. He looked at her. He looked at the well. "Why are you here?" he said. "I told you my father—" "No," he said it quietly. "You delivered that message already. He can send Crowell with the next one. So why are you here?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the well and then at the barn and then at the eastern pasture, where the grass was winter brown but still thick and evident even at this distance. "You see something in this property that my father doesn't," she said. "Lot of men have property. Don't mean they see it. He sees profit and access. That's all he's ever seen in land." She paused. "I've been watching his acquisitions since I was 12 years old, and I understand cattle and grass and water probably better than anyone he employs, and he has never once asked my opinion about a purchase." Callum said nothing. "I came the first time because he asked me to," she said. "I came back because I wanted to." The wind moved through the creek brush and rattled the barn door on its single remaining hinge, and Callum listened to all of it. "I'll take help I don't have to pay for," he said finally. "That's not pride, that's arithmetic. I'm not offering charity." "I know you're not." She pulled off her gloves and looked at the well casing. "You have rope and a bucket system we can rig for pulling the loose stones?" "Barn, second hook on the left wall." "Then let's see what we're dealing with." They spent the better part of that morning at the well, with Callum lowering himself on a rope and Rosalind working the bucket system from the surface, and by noon they had identified the break and pulled enough stones to understand the scope of the repair. It was manageable. It would take 3 days of hard work and a specific type of mortar he'd need to order from town, but it was manageable. When they stopped for water at midday, Callum noticed she ate from a pack she'd brought herself, and that the food was plain, bread and dried meat, nothing that announced itself. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I told you I did. I believed you. I'm telling you, you're right." She tore a piece of bread without looking up. "Most people assume I learned it from books." "Did you?" "Some of it. The rest from walking the land with the foreman when I was young enough that they didn't think to tell me to go back inside. And now they tell you. Now my father would tell me." She looked up then. "He wants me to marry a man named Whitfield from Cascade County. The union would consolidate 2 significant cattle operations." "What do you want?" The question seemed to catch her somewhere she hadn't expected to be caught. She sat with it for a moment before answering. "I want to know whether a ranch can be built out of something everyone else has written off," she said. "I want to see if it's actually possible." "You're looking at it." "I know." She looked at the pasture again. "That's why I came back." Horace Vane arrived on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks into what had become a quiet routine. Rosalind appearing 3 or 4 mornings a week, working alongside Callum on whichever problem was most pressing, leaving in the afternoon without ceremony. They had repaired the well to the point where it ran clear and strong. They had reinforced 2 full sections of the south fence. They had identified the worst of the barn's structural failures and established an order of priority for repairs that accounted for the weather coming. Callum heard the horses before he saw them. a group of 4 coming fast down the ridge road. He was on the barn roof when they came through the gate, and he stayed there long enough to register who it was before climbing down. Horace Vane was 61 years old and built like a man who had done real work for the first 2 decades of his life and managed it ever since. He was not what Callum had pictured, not soft, not the kind of man who let others do his physical confrontations for him. His face had the particular quality of someone who has won most arguments, not by intelligence alone, but by absolute refusal to accept that losing was an option. Rosalind was standing near the well when her father came through the gate. Callum watched something pass across her face, not fear exactly, but a kind of bracing, the way a person adjusts their weight before something heavy arrives. Rosalind. Horace said her name without heat, which was more alarming than anger would have been. He stopped his horse, swung down, handed the reins to one of his men without looking at him. His eyes moved from his daughter to the repaired well casing to Callum, and he assembled what he saw into something Callum could not read. "Father," Rosalind said, "you've been spending your mornings here." "I have. I asked you to deliver a message. I did not ask you to become a ranch hand." "I didn't become anything. I've been helping with repairs." Horace looked at Callum for the first time with his full attention. Callum held the look without moving. He was still holding a hammer from the barn work, not as a gesture, just because he'd been in the middle of something when they arrived. "Mr. Rourke," Horace said. "Mr. Vane, you've done something to my daughter's schedule that I find inconvenient. She came of her own accord. I didn't recruit her. She's been doing work that is beneath her." Callum looked at the well. He looked at the fence line they'd repaired together. He looked back at Horace. "No disrespect," he said, "but I haven't seen her do anything that looked beneath her. She's done it well." Horace's jaw moved. He turned to Rosalind. "We're leaving." "I'm not finished," Rosalind said. The silence that came after that was the particular silence of something that had never happened before. Callum watched Horace process his daughter's response and saw the moment the man understood that the word no had arrived from a direction he hadn't prepared for. "Rosalind, I heard you, Father. I'm telling you, I'm not finished." She said it quietly, the way she said everything. No performance, no volume, just certainty. "Mr. Rourke and I have 2 more hours of work and then I'll come home." Horace looked at his daughter. He looked at Callum. He looked at the repaired well casing, at the fence line, at the barn roof where the new shingles were partially laid. Something moved through his expression that Callum couldn't name. It was not approval. It might have been something older than that. 2 hours, Horace said. He got back on his horse. He and his men rode back out the gate, and Callum stood with his hammer in his hand and watched the most powerful man in Holt County leave his property without getting what he'd come for. He looked at Rosalind. She was watching her father's retreating back with an expression that was hard to read, something complicated, something that had more history in it than the last 20 minutes. "That happen often?" Callum said. "Never." She turned back to the barn. "Let's finish the roof section before it gets dark." The thing about the well, the sealed one, not the working one, was that Callum had known it was there from Deacon's property records, but hadn't gotten to it yet in his list of problems to address. It sat at the northeastern corner of the property, close to the fence line that bordered Vane's grazing land, ringed by old stone and capped with a flat rock and a layer of mortar that had been applied deliberately. He wouldn't have thought about it again for months, maybe longer, but Rosalind brought it up one morning, obliquely at first, the way she brought up anything that was turning itself over in her mind. "The northeastern corner," she said. "What do you know about the original boundary survey?" "What's in the deed? Deacons didn't tell me much." "There was a dispute," she said, "between my father and the man who owned this property before Deacon's. I was 9 or 10. I remember it because the lawyers were in the house for almost a week." Callum set down what he was working on. He looked at her. "What kind of dispute?" "Boundary location. My father maintained the creek shifted over the years and that the property line had always favored our side. The other owner, I can't remember his name now, said the line had been moved, that his deed showed it differently." She paused. "The lawyer settled it in my father's favor. The other man sold to Deacon's not long after." "Why are you telling me this now?" She looked at the northeastern corner. "Because I remember the sealed well. I remember asking about it and being told it was filled in during the boundary dispute. And I've been looking at your property records and there's a small stone structure at that corner that's in neither survey." They found it the next morning. 20 minutes of walking the corner fence line, and there it was. A stone cap mortared over, sitting in a hollow that the surrounding brush had grown up around so completely that you'd need to know what you were looking for. They looked at it for a while. "We should open it," Rosalind said. "It's on my property," Callum said. "Whatever's in there is mine to know about." It took most of the morning. The mortar was old but well applied, and the rock cap was heavy. When they finally got it open, Callum lowered a lantern down on a rope, and the first thing he saw, resting on a ledge of stone about 8 feet down, was a metal box. Not large, roughly the size of a thick ledger book, rusted at the corners, but sealed well enough that when Callum got it open with a chisel, the documents inside, folded tight, wrapped in oilcloth, were intact. He spread them on the porch table. He weighted the corners with stones, and Rosalind, reading over his shoulder, went very still. The first document was a boundary deed, original with surveyor's marks and dates. The line it showed placed the eastern fence of Cinder Creek nearly 80 yards east of where Callum's current fence stood, which meant that 80 yards of what Callum now looked across as Horace Vane's grazing land had never, legally, been Horace Vane's at all. The second document was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, dated 1877, addressed to no one and signed only with initials, but the content was clear enough. It described a payment, made to a surveyor, made by Lucian Crowell acting on behalf of Horace Vane's cattle company, in exchange for a revised survey that relocated the Cinder Creek boundary line westward by, the letter was specific, 78 yards along the eastern fence. It described the sealing of the original deed and the well that held it, and it described the stone marker on the true boundary line that had been removed. Callum read it twice. He set it down. Rosalind had not moved. "Rosalind," he said. "I see it," she said. Quiet. Not surprised, or surprised in the way you're surprised by something you've been carrying the shape of for years without knowing what it was. "Your father, I don't know what my father knew." She said it carefully and deliberately. "I know what Crowell did. I know what this says Crowell did. These documents are enough to contest the boundary. These documents are enough to do more than that." She folded the letter back along its original creases. Her hands were steady. "We need to get to the county recorder before Crowell finds out we found these." Callum looked at her. He understood what she was saying. And he understood what it cost her to say it, because those 80 acres, legally restored, would contract her father's holdings and would confirm that the most significant land arrangement Horace Vane had made in Holt County in 12 years had been built on fraud. "You understand what this means for your family," he said. "I understand what it means if the truth stays buried." She met his eyes. "I've been watching my father acquire land my entire life. I never questioned where it came from. I should have asked harder questions." "This isn't your fault." "No," she said, "but staying quiet now would be." She picked up the oilcloth and began carefully refolding the documents. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, and she did not look at him while she did it. "Get the horse," she said. "We should go now, while Crowell's men aren't watching the road." Callum went to get the horse. He stopped at the barn door and looked back at her, at the woman sitting at his porch table with her father's ruin in her hands, refolding it carefully, protecting it, preparing to deliver it to the people who would use it as it deserved. He had bought Cinder Creek because he wanted land that was his. He had not expected it to come with this. He had not expected any of this. He brought the horse around, and they rode toward town in the cold afternoon light, the documents secure in the inside pocket of Callum's coat, and neither of them spoke about what came next. There was too much of it, and the road was long, and the wind was coming down off the mountains now with the particular edge that said winter was no longer planning, it was arriving. But Rosalind rode straight-backed and certain beside him, and Callum Rourke had spent 15 years reading weather and land and the character of horses, and he understood enough about all three to know that what rode beside him now was not fragile. Whatever came next, she would not break. He'd stake Cinder Creek on it. The county recorder's office in Holt County sat on the second floor of a building that also housed a feed merchant and a dentist, and the stairs creaked in a particular sequence that announced every visitor before they arrived at the top. Callum noticed this on the way up and filed it away in the automatic way. He filed things that might matter later. The recorder himself was a man named Aldous Fitch, somewhere in his 50s. Ink-stained at the cuffs, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades watching people bring him documents they wanted buried as often as documents they wanted found. He looked at Callum. He looked at Rosalind. He looked at the oilcloth package on his desk without touching it. "Miss Vane," he said. Not unfriendly. Careful. "Mr. Fitch." She was equally careful. "We need to file a boundary contest and have the original documents in this package recorded and sealed under county protection." Fitch looked at the package again. "May I?" "Please." He unfolded the oilcloth. He read the boundary deed first, slowly, running one finger along the surveyor's notations without touching the text itself. Then he read the letter. He read it twice, the same way Callum had. He set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. "Where did these come from?" he said. "A sealed well on my property," Callum said, "northeast corner near the boundary line in question." "How long sealed?" "Mortar suggests 12 years, maybe more." Fitch looked at Rosalind. This was the question he actually wanted answered, and they both understood that. "Miss Vane, you understand what recording these documents initiates." "I do. Your father, I understand what it means for my father." She held his gaze without shifting. "I also understand what it means if these documents go back into the ground." Fitch was quiet for a moment. The dentist downstairs was working on someone from the sound of it. A wagon went by on the street below. Normal afternoon sounds. Nothing about them felt normal. "I'll need witnesses to the recovery," Fitch said, "and a signed statement from you both about where and how these were found. The contest filing itself will become public record." "That's what we want," Callum said. "Public record means Crowell's office will know within 2 days. Possibly 1. "I know." Fitch looked at him steadily. "You've got nobody out at Cinder Creek but yourself." "That's been the case since I bought the place. Hasn't changed my situation much." Something in Fitch's expression shifted. Not quite admiration, closer to the recognition one careful man gives another. He reached for his pen. "Then let's get the statements written," he said. They were back on their road to Cinder Creek before 4 o'clock, the sky going gray-white in the way that meant serious cold before morning. Rosalind rode beside him and said nothing for the first half-mile, and Callum had learned enough about the rhythm of her silences to know this one was working through something it hadn't finished with yet. "Fitch will hold," she said finally. "I think so." "Crowell will go to him first, try to have the filing suppressed or delayed. Fitch knows what the documents are. He's not going to put his name next to something that gets examined later." "No," she paused. "Crowell won't stop at Fitch." Callum looked at her. "I know. He'll come to you. He's been coming to me since before I opened that well. The conversation changes some. The answer doesn't." She turned and looked at him directly in the way she did when she was assessing something and not bothering to hide it. "You're not worried." "I'm worried," Callum said. "I'm just not going to let it decide anything for me." She looked back at the road. "He'll have men, more than the last time. Then I'll need to be smarter than having men." Another silence. The road bent west along the creek bottom, and the cottonwoods on either side had dropped most of their leaves, the branches bare and gray against the pale sky. "I should tell my father before Crowell does," she said. Callum thought about that. What does he know? About the boundary? About what Crowell did? "I don't know." She said it like it was the most honest answer available and also the most painful one. He knew there was a dispute. He knew it resolved in his favor. Whether he knew how it resolved, she stopped. "My father is not a good man in some ways and a very good man in others, and I've spent my entire life trying to figure out which category covers which actions." Callum didn't respond immediately. He thought about Horace arriving at Cinder Creek and looking at the repaired well and the fence line and something moving through his expression that wasn't anger. "He came himself," Callum said, "when he found out you were here. He didn't send Crowell." "Yes, that's something." "It's something," she agreed. "I don't know yet what." They parted at the Cinder Creek gate. Rosalind sat her horse for a moment, looking at the ranch in the flat afternoon light. The barn with its half-finished roof repairs, the fence lines, the creek running dark in the cut of the valley. "I'll go to him tonight," she said. "All right. If he—" She stopped, started again. "If the conversation goes badly, I may not be in a position to come back here for a while." Callum held the gatepost with one hand and looked up at her. "Rosalind, yes. Whatever happens with your father, whatever he decides, what you did today, bringing those documents to Fitch, that was the right thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know it was. I want you to know I know it cost something." She looked away at the creek. A muscle worked in her jaw. When she looked back, her expression was composed, but it had taken something to get it there. "Take care of those documents you kept copies of. Don't leave them where anyone can find them without finding you first." She turned the horse and rode. Callum watched her go up the ridge road until she was out of sight, then walked back to his barn and spent the next hour putting every copy he'd made into a location that would require dismantling part of his floor to reach. Crowell came the following morning. earlier than Callum had expected, which meant the news had moved faster than Fitch's 2-day estimate, which meant Crowell had someone inside the recorder's office, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. There were 5 men this time. Crowell rode in front, unhurried, and the 5 men arranged themselves in a way that blocked the gate and put the barn at Callum's back. It was done with a kind of casual precision that told Callum this hadn't been improvised. Callum was at the woodpile when they came through. He kept splitting wood for 2 more strokes before he set down the axe and turned around. "Mr. Crowell! Mr. Rourke!" Crowell dismounted. He did not bring his usual folded paper this time. His hands were empty, which was more deliberate than holding something would have been. "You filed a boundary contest." "I have." "Against the Vane Cattle Company's established eastern boundary." "Against an incorrectly surveyed line?" "Yes." Crowell's face didn't change. The original survey was conducted by a licensed county surveyor in 1877 and upheld in a legal proceeding. The original survey was purchased from a licensed county surveyor in 1877, and the true boundary deed was sealed in a well on my property. Callum kept his voice level. "You know that. I know you know that. So let's not spend each other's time." Something moved behind Crowell's eyes. Brief. "You have documents you believe support this claim." "I have documents that do support it. They're recorded now. County seal. Aldous Fitch witnessed the filing himself." "Documents can be disputed. Provenance questioned. A letter with initials isn't a signed confession." "No," Callum said, "but it's enough to open a formal investigation. And a formal investigation means surveyors. And surveyors means that boundary marker that got removed will leave a trace in the soil that 12 years of grass hasn't covered." He paused. "You know more about that than I do." The 5 men had not moved. The nearest one was about 15 feet to Callum's left. Callum had not looked directly at any of them, because the information was with Crowell, and because looking at the men would be admitting that the men were the point. "Mr. Rourke," Crowell said quietly, with the tone of a man who has decided to drop the performance and speak plainly, "you are one person on 240 acres. You have limited resources, no legal representation, and a winter coming that will strain everything you've built here to its limit. I'm prepared to offer you a number that resolves all of that, substantially above market. You walk away with more than this property will generate in 15 years of operation." "And the documents?" "As part of the arrangement, yes." Callum looked at him. "And the family of the man you cheated out of 80 acres 12 years ago?" Crowell didn't answer. "Because that's what those documents represent," Callum said. "Not just a line on a map. A man who sold his ranch and left the county because he couldn't win a boundary dispute that was decided before it started. I want to know what happens to him in your arrangement. That matter is settled and has been for over a decade. That matter is exactly what my filing is going to unsettle." Callum picked up the axe. Not as a threat, just because it was there and his hands needed to be doing something. "I'm not selling, I'm not withdrawing the filing, and I'm not giving you anything that's been recorded, because I don't have authority to do that anymore. It's county property now." Crowell stood in Callum's yard and looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalculating a problem he thought he'd already solved. "This will become very difficult for you," Crowell said. "It already is." Callum turned back to the woodpile. "Close the gate on your way out." The 5 men looked at Crowell. Crowell stood another moment. Then he walked back to his horse and mounted and rode out without another word, and the 5 men followed him, and the gate swung closed behind the last one. Callum split 3 more pieces of wood before his hands steadied. Rosalind did not come the next day or the day after. On the 3rd day, one of Vane's ranch hands, a young man Callum had seen twice before in town, rode to the gate and handed over a folded note without getting down from his horse. The note was in Rosalind's handwriting. It said, "Father knows. Conversation ongoing. Stay on the property if you can." Our Callum read it twice and burned it in the stove. Stay on the property was good advice and bad news in equal measure. Good because it meant Rosalind thought there was something out here that needed staying near. Bad because she'd felt the need to say it, which meant she knew something about the direction of Crowell's next move. He made himself useful. He finished the barn roof. He reinforced the 3rd section of south fence. He put the remaining winter hay up in the loft and inventoried his supplies, and concluded he could last until March without a supply run if he was careful, and he would be careful. He checked the gate latch every evening before dark. He kept the axe within reach. On the 5th day, a man he didn't recognize rode slowly along the ridge road past his property line twice in the same afternoon, not stopping. just looking. Callum watched from the barn door both times and did not go to the gate. On the 6th day, 2 of the fence posts along the eastern boundary, his eastern boundary, the contested line, had been knocked loose from the ground and were lying in the grass. No hoof prints that he could read clearly. Done in the dark, most likely, or before first light. Callum reset the posts himself. He drove them deeper than before. On the 7th day, Rosalind came back. She came alone, and she came early, while the frost was still on the grass, and she looked like she hadn't slept well in a week, which she probably hadn't. She unsaddled her horse herself and put it in the barn with Callum's and came to where he was working on the barn door and stood with her arms crossed against the cold. "Well," Callum said. He knew, she said, not everything, but he knew the boundary line had been adjusted. He told me Crowell handled the survey arrangements and he didn't ask for details. She exhaled. He said he thought the original dispute had merit on both sides and that Crowell's resolution was, his word, expedient. Expedient. He's been using that word for 12 years to cover the fact that he let Crowell do something he couldn't officially sanction. Callum set down his tool. He looked at her. How'd he take it, finding out what was in the well? Badly. She said it flat. Not the way I expected. He didn't get angry at me. He got quiet. The kind of quiet that's worse. She pulled her coat tighter. He fired Crowell. That stopped Callum. He fired him? Terminated his contract, effective immediately. Told him to collect his files and be off Vaneland before nightfall. Crowell's been his attorney for 12 years. I know. That's not a small thing. No. She met his eyes. But Crowell knew. He didn't just adjust a line. He sealed the evidence. He buried the original deed. That's different from my father's convenient ignorance, and my father understood the difference when he saw it written down. Callum thought about Crowell's careful face, his empty hands, the 5 men arranged to block the gate. He thought about the knocked loose fence posts in the dark. Crowell's not going to accept being removed quietly, he said. I know that too. She looked at the eastern fence line. He has copies of things, arrangements he's made over the years. He's been Vane's attorney long enough to have considerable material that my father would not want examined. So Crowell's got his own leverage, which makes him more dangerous fired than employed. She looked back at Callum. My father wants to meet with you. Callum considered that for a moment. Why? Because he made a decision and he wants to look at the man it affects while he makes it. What decision? He wants to support the boundary filing. She watched him absorb that. He is prepared to provide a sworn statement confirming that the boundary dispute was improperly resolved and that the 1877 survey was arranged by Crowell outside of legitimate process. He can't undo what was done, but he can stop fighting what the documents prove. The cold moved through the barn door, and Callum stood in it and looked at the woman who had arrived 5 weeks ago with her father's money in her saddlebag and was now standing in his barn, having spent a week dismantling the architecture of her own family's advantage. He's going to lose 80 acres, Callum said. Yes. And his reputation takes a hit regardless of what he says now. Yes. And he still wants to do it. She looked at him steadily. He wants to do it because I told him that it wasn't a choice between his reputation and the truth. I told him it was a choice between the kind of man he'd been and the kind of man he had time left to be. She paused. He's 61 years old and his wife died 3 years ago, and I think he's been looking for something to do with the years he has left that doesn't just accumulate more of the same. She stopped. Or maybe I'm telling myself that because it's easier. You don't believe that. She looked at him. Something unguarded moved through her expression. No, she said. I don't. They stood in the cold barn for a moment. The horses shifted. The wind found a gap in the siding somewhere and made a low sound through it. When does he want to meet? Callum said. Tomorrow, at Vane's main house. I'll be there. She nodded. She started to turn back to the horses and then stopped. Callum. He looked at her. Crowell went to see the man who conducted the original survey, she said. The surveyor who took the payment in 1877. His name is Garveth. He's still alive, living outside of town. Crowell visited him the day after my father dismissed him. Callum understood immediately. Crowell's trying to get Garveth to recant, or to claim the letters a forgery. I think so. Garveth is old and not well off, and a visit from Crowell is the kind of thing that frightens an old man. Can Fitch protect the filed documents from a credibility challenge? Fitch can protect the documents. He can't force Garveth to tell the truth if Garveth's been persuaded to say otherwise. She met his eyes. Someone should talk to Garveth before Crowell finishes talking to him. Callum looked at her. You know where he lives? South Road, past the Miller Crossing. There's a white house with a broken-down windmill in the yard. You can't miss it. You could go yourself. I'm Horace Vane's daughter. She said it simply. Garveth sees me coming, and he'll think I'm there to pressure him the other direction. He needs to hear from someone with no family name attached to any of this. She was right. She was almost always right about the practical shape of a problem, which was something Callum had stopped being surprised by and started simply relying on. I'll go this afternoon, he said. Thank you. She went to saddle her horse, and Callum went to find his coat, and the problem that had begun as a fence corner and a sealed well was now wide and deep and tangled in the lives of enough people that pulling one thread moved 6 others, and the cold was coming down off the mountains, and Crowell was somewhere out there doing the kind of quiet damage that careful men do when they understand that their position is collapsing. Garveth lived in a house that had been better when he was younger and hadn't kept pace with the years since. The windmill in the yard was broken the way things go broken when no one with the energy to fix them lives there anymore, slowly, gracefully, without drama. Callum tied his horse at the fence post and knocked. The man who answered was in his late 70s, thin in the way that age makes some men thin, with hands that had done precise work once and showed it in the way they held themselves even at rest. He looked at Callum with the expression of a man who has been expecting someone unpleasant and isn't sure yet which kind this is. Mr. Garveth, Callum said, my name's Callum Rourke. I own the Cinder Creek property. Garveth was quiet. I'm not here to threaten you, Callum said. I'm not here for Horace Vane, and I'm not working for Lucian Crowell. I came because I think you've been put in a bad position, and I'd like to understand it. Garveth looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back. The interior of the house was sparse and clean and smelled of wood smoke and old paper. A surveying instrument sat on a shelf, too old to be functional now, kept the way you keep a thing that mattered. Garveth sat down at a small table and did not offer coffee, which was honest. He came yesterday, the old man said, without preamble, like he'd been sitting with it and needed somewhere to put it. Crowell. Told me the letter was mine, my initials. He looked at his hands. Said if I confirmed it publicly, my name gets attached to a fraud case that's now a county matter. Your name's already attached, Callum said, carefully. The initials in the letter match your name. That doesn't change whether you talk or stay quiet. Garveth's jaw worked. He said there were ways to challenge the document, cast doubt on when it was written, on whether it was genuine. Can he do that? A good attorney can do anything in front of a judge who doesn't look too hard. The old man looked up. I was paid. I moved the line. I did it because I needed the money and because Crowell made it clear that surveyors who didn't cooperate with Vane's land arrangements didn't get contracts in this county. He said it flat, like a ledger entry. I've known what I did since I did it. I've not been comfortable about it. Callum sat across from him. The man who owned that property before Deacon's. What was his name? Haller. Ed Haller. He had a wife and 2 daughters. What happened to them? Garveth looked at the surveying instrument on the shelf. Haller sold the property for about 1/3 of what it was worth once the boundary reduced it. Moved the family east. I heard his wife died not long after. Heart trouble, they said. He was quiet. I don't know what became of the daughters. Callum said nothing for a moment. Mr. Garveth, Crowell's going to lose this. The original deed is county recorded and Horace Vane is preparing to provide testimony confirming the boundary fraud. With or without your statement, the line is going to be restored. The question is whether you spend the rest of your time carrying this alone or whether you set it down. Setting it down means a signed statement confirming what the letter describes. The payment, the relocated line, the sealed well. Callum leaned forward slightly. You said you haven't been comfortable about it. I'm telling you there's an action available to you that's the opposite of what Crowell wants. The old man was quiet for a long time. A log shifted in the stove. Outside, the broken windmill made a sound like something trying to remember what it was for. If I sign a statement, Garveth said, Crowell is a dismissed attorney with no client and a fraud case on his hands. What he does next is concern himself with his own exposure. Callum held the old man's gaze. He's got less leverage than he's pretending to have. Garveth looked at his hands again, then at the surveying instrument on the shelf, then at Callum. You got paper, the old man said. Callum reached into his coat. It took the better part of an hour. Garveth wrote slowly and carefully in the precise hand of a man trained in documentation, and when he was done, he read it back to himself and made 2 small corrections and signed it with his full name. He handed it to Callum without ceremony. "The Haller daughters," he said, "if they can be found. Whatever comes out of that restored acreage, I don't know what's right, but something should find its way to them." "I'll raise that with Vane," Callum said. He folded the statement and put it inside his coat. "Thank you." The old man looked at him with the expression of someone who has put something heavy down after carrying it for years and is not yet sure how it feels to stand upright without the weight of it. "Don't thank me," Garveth said. "I should have done this 12 years ago." Callum left him sitting at the table in the quiet house and rode back toward Cinder Creek in the failing afternoon light, the signed statement against his chest, and the cold coming in hard from the north now, and somewhere ahead of him a meeting with Horace Vane in the morning and Crowell somewhere in the dark between. The stars were out by the time he reached his gate. He put his horse up and went inside and set the signed statement with the other documents beneath the floor and sat at his table for a while in the dark before he lit the lamp. He thought about Ed Haller's wife. He thought about the 2 daughters. He thought about a line moved 78 yards in the dark and what it had cost and how long the cost had been paid by the wrong people. Then he lit the lamp and made something to eat and went over the next morning's conversation in his head until he understood it well enough to sleep. The Vane main house was larger than Callum had pictured, which was saying something because he'd pictured it large. It sat at the end of a quarter-mile drive lined with fence posts that were plumb and true and spoke of money applied to practical things, which told Callum something about Horace that the man's reputation hadn't. The house itself was 2 stories of timber and stone, built to last rather than to impress, which was a different kind of statement than most wealthy men made with their homes. Rosalind met him at the gate. She looked like she'd slept some, not enough, and she'd dressed with the same practical plainness she always carried, good coat worn at the elbows, hair back and functional. She looked at him and then at the coat pocket where the documents were and gave a small nod. "Garveth's statement," Callum said. "He signed it." He signed it. Something moved through her face that wasn't quite relief, more like the release of a breath she'd been holding since she sent him down the south road the afternoon before. How was he? "Tired," Callum said. "The way a man's tired when he's been carrying something heavy for too long and knows the carrying hasn't done anyone any good." She was quiet a moment. Then, "My father's inside. He knows you're coming. I told him about Garveth last night." She paused. "He didn't sleep much either." They went inside. Horace Vane was in a room that was clearly where he worked. Not a formal parlor, not a room arranged for receiving people, but a room with maps on the walls and ledger books on the shelves and a desk that had the scarred, ink-marked surface of something that had been used hard for many years. He was standing when they came in, which Callum registered. A man who stays seated when someone enters is telling you something about the power arrangement. A man who stands is telling you something else. "Mr. Rourke," Horace said. "Mr. Vane." They looked at each other across the room. Callum had the particular feeling of a conversation that had been happening in some form for weeks now, finally arriving at the place where it could be spoken plainly. Horace gestured to the chairs near the desk. They sat, all 3 of them, which was also something. Rosalind sat to the side, not between them, not apart from them, present. Horace folded his hands on the desk. He looked at them and then at Callum. "Rosalind tells me you recovered a signed statement from Garveth. Signed and dated yesterday afternoon." Callum laid it on the desk. He laid Fitch's copy of the county filing beside it. He did not lay down Garveth's original letter. That was still under his floor at Cinder Creek. Some things you kept in reserve until you understood the shape of the room you were in. Horace read the statement. He read it the way he'd read everything, Callum suspected, thoroughly, without rushing, without performing the act of reading. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Garveth was a competent surveyor, he said. Before all this. He still is, by his hands. Callum paused. He said he wanted whatever comes from the restored acreage to find its way to Haller's daughters, if they can be located. Horace looked at him. Something crossed his face. Not surprise. Something older. I didn't know about Haller's wife. Garveth knew. Crowell handled the arrangements. I told myself that meant I didn't need to examine the arrangements. He said it without the tone of a man seeking absolution. He said it the way you read a line item in a ledger that doesn't balance. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about it for 12 years, and I understood I was wrong before Rosalind put documents in front of me. He stopped. Found it easier not to examine, Callum said. Horace looked at him directly. Yes. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was working in the stable yard, the sound of a wagon being moved, a horse objecting mildly to something. What are you prepared to do? Callum said. I'll provide a sworn statement to the county court confirming that the boundary arrangement was handled outside legitimate process and that I had reason to believe the 1877 survey was not conducted in good faith. He said it evenly. That statement, combined with the original deed and Garveth's account, should be sufficient for the court to order a resurvey and restore the line. It will cost you 80 acres of your best grazing land. I know what it will cost me. And Crowell. Crowell will face whatever the county prosecutor determines is appropriate. Horace's voice had a particular flatness on that sentence. The flatness of a man who has made a decision and closed the door on second-guessing it. I've already had my new attorney, a man from Helena, not a local arrangement, send Crowell a letter informing him that any materials he holds from his time representing this company are to be returned and that any attempt to use privileged information as personal leverage will be addressed accordingly. He'll fight it. He'll try. Horace unfolded his hands. Lucian Crowell has been useful to me for a long time. Useful men sometimes mistake usefulness for protection. He's about to learn the difference. Callum sat with all of that for a moment. He looked at Rosalind. She was watching her father with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between grief and something that might eventually become the opposite of grief. There's one more thing, Callum said. Howler's family. Whatever the court awards in terms of the restored boundary, the acreage and its value during the period of the incorrect survey, that's a damage question. But if you went to them directly before the court gets there and made an offer of compensation, it would be an acknowledgement. Yes, of liability. Of responsibility, Callum said, which is different. Horace looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to go further than the law requires. I'm not asking you anything, Callum said. I'm telling you what Garveth said and what I think it's worth. Another silence. Rosalind made no move to speak. This was between the two men now, and she seemed to understand it. I'll have my attorney locate Howler's daughters, Horace said, and I'll make an offer before the court proceeding, not after. Callum nodded. He picked up Garveth's statement and the county filing and put them back in his coat. He left the statement he'd brought for Horace on the desk. One more thing, Horace said, as Callum started to rise. Callum settled back. My daughter has been spending her mornings on your property for 5 weeks, Horace said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man arriving at a topic through the back door because the front door was harder to open. I want to understand what that is. Father, Rosalind started. I'm asking him, Horace said, not unkindly. He kept his eyes on Callum. Callum held the older man's gaze and answered with the same plainness he'd been using since the first day. She came because she knows land and cattle and she saw something worth working on. I accepted the help because I needed it and because she's worth listening to. Whatever else it is, he paused, is between her and me. Horace looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Rosalind, who was sitting straight and still and watching her father with an expression that had stopped performing anything at all and was simply present. All right, Horace said. It was 2 words. It carried more weight than a paragraph. They left together, Callum and Rosalind, and walked out to where their horses stood in the yard, and neither of them said anything until they were on the road back toward Cinder Creek, with the morning light coming flat and pale across the valley. He meant it, Rosalind said. All of it. I know. In my memory, he's never walked back from a position once he took it, not publicly. She was quiet a beat. This is something different for him. Looks like. She looked at him sideways. What he asked you. About me. Yes. What you said. Yes. She looked forward at the road. That was honest. I didn't have another setting to try. Something that was nearly a smile crossed her face. Not quite, but nearly. Crowell moved 4 days after the meeting with Horace, and he moved the way Callum had expected him to. Not openly, not with papers or hired men at the gate, but sideways, through a channel that Callum hadn't fully accounted for. He went to Judge Prentice. Prentice was the county district judge, a man in his 60s with a reputation for careful jurisprudence and a financial history that, it turned out, included a series of land investments arranged through Crowell's office in the 1880s that had done very well for Prentice and somewhat less well for the sellers. Callum learned this from Fitch, who rode out to Cinder Creek on a Tuesday morning with the look of a man delivering news he'd rather not be carrying. Prentice has agreed to hear a challenge to the admissibility of the filed documents before the boundary case reaches the formal docket, Fitch said. He was standing near the well, the working one, the one Callum and Rosalind had repaired, turning his hat in his hands in a way that said this wasn't a conversation he'd prepared for. Crowell filed an emergency motion yesterday afternoon, claims the documents were recovered under irregular circumstances and that the original deed's provenance can't be established. He's trying to get them excluded before the case is even heard. If he succeeds, the boundary filing has no evidentiary foundation. It gets dismissed. Fitch put his hat back on. The hearing is set for 3 weeks out. Prentice's court. Prentice, who has a financial relationship with Crowell's arrangements. A historical one. Hard to prove, harder to raise without looking like you're attacking the court. Fitch looked at him steadily. You need an attorney, Mr. Rourke. Today, not next week. I know. The man Vane brought in from Helena. I'm not asking Vane to fight this for me. Fitch looked at him with the expression of a man watching someone be principled in a direction that might hurt them. This isn't the time to be independent. It's not independence, Callum said. If Vane's Helena attorney handles this, it becomes Vane's case against Crowell with my property in the middle. I need it to be my case, my filing, my land. He looked at Fitch. What I need from Vane is his sworn statement. The case stays mine. Fitch absorbed that. He nodded once. Then find representation in the next 10 days, before Crowell can file supplemental motions. He rode back toward a town, and Callum went inside and sat at his table and tried to calculate what attorney's fees would do to a financial situation that was already stretched toward its outer boundary. He was still sitting there when Rosalind arrived. She could read the shape of a room the way she read land, quickly and without needing it explained. She sat down across from him and listened while he laid out what Fitch had told him, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. There's an attorney in Billings, she said. Margaret Cord. She handled a water rights case in Yellowstone County last year that ran against 2 established cattle companies and won. She takes cases on partial contingency when she believes in them. You know her. I know of her. I read the Yellowstone case in the county records because I was curious how it was argued. She paused. I'd like to write to her. Today, if you'll let me. Callum looked at her. Why are you doing this? She held his gaze. Because it's the right thing to do. Rosalind. Because I think you're... She stopped. She looked at the table and then back at him, and when she spoke again, the careful composure had moved slightly, not broken, but shifted enough to show something underneath. Because what you're fighting for is worth fighting for, and I don't intend to watch you lose it on a technicality engineered by a man like Crowell. The room held that for a moment. Write to her, Callum said. She wrote the letter at his table using paper he found in the drawer where he kept supply receipts. She wrote quickly and without revision, the way she did things when she knew what she meant. When she finished, she read it back once, folded it, and addressed it in her plain, precise handwriting. I'll send it from town today, she said. She should have it by Thursday. And if she won't take it, then we find someone else, but she'll take it. She looked at him with the quiet certainty she carried about the things she'd thought through. She'll take it because Garveth's signed account and the original deed together are the kind of evidence that doesn't come available often, and an attorney who won the Yellowstone case on worse will understand that. She was right. Cord's reply arrived 6 days later, addressed to Callum but sent to the Cinder Creek gate, and she agreed to take the case on the terms Rosalind had proposed. By then, other things had moved. Crowell had not been idle. On the Wednesday after Fitch's visit, 2 of Callum's eastern fence posts were pulled from the ground and thrown into the creek. Not knocked loose this time. Pulled deliberately, with enough force to leave the ground torn around the holes. Callum reset them without going to anyone about it because going to anyone required evidence he couldn't produce and time he didn't have. On the Friday, someone cut the water diversion channel that fed the cattle tank on the south pasture. A clean cut, done with a tool, not weather damage. Callum repaired it himself in 2 hours, but it cost him a morning and the cattle were unsettled for a day after. On the Saturday, 3 men he didn't know rode along his property line slowly for the better part of an afternoon without crossing it. They weren't Crowell's regular people. Different faces, rougher presentation. Hired for this specific purpose and then they'd be gone, which was how you kept your distance from what they did. He said nothing to Rosalind about the fence post or the water channel. He told himself it was because telling her served no purpose. He was mostly right about that, and partly wrong in the way you're wrong when you're protecting someone without their consent. She found out about the water channel from the channel itself. She spotted the repair when she arrived Monday morning and read it immediately for what it was. "When?" she said. "Friday." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me. Nothing you could have done about it. That's not why you tell people things." She said it plainly, not angry, just correcting the record. You tell people things because they're in it with you and they deserve to know. Callum looked at her for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you." She held his gaze another second, then turned back to the channel. "He's trying to wear you down before the hearing. Make the maintenance costs high enough that you can't sustain the fight." "I know what he's doing. The fence post too." "Yes." "We need to document it. Every incident. Written, dated, witnessed where possible." She turned back to him. "Cord will want it, and Prentice, whatever his arrangement with Crowell, will not enjoy having a documented pattern of harassment entered into evidence in his court." They spent that morning walking the property line and writing down everything. The fence posts, the water channel, the slow riders along the boundary. Dates, damage, repair times, cost. Rosalind wrote it in her precise hand, and Callum signed it, and they made 2 copies and sent one to Cord in Billings. It was practical work, ordinary in form, but they walked every foot of Cinder Creek's boundary doing it, and somewhere in that walking Callum understood that Rosalind Vane had stopped being a visitor on his property. She walked it the way you walk, land you've decided has a claim on you. He didn't say that. He wasn't sure he had the words for it yet, or whether the words were the right instrument for it at all. Margaret Cord arrived from Billings on a Wednesday, 12 days before the Prentice hearing, and she was not what Callum had pictured, which was becoming a pattern in his life that he was growing accustomed to. She was in her mid-40s, compact, with the manner of someone who had learned early that the fastest way to be taken seriously in rooms that didn't expect to take her seriously was to be better prepared than everyone else in the room combined. She sat at Callum's table and read every document, the original deed, Garveth's statement, the county filing, the incident log, without speaking. When she finished, she looked up and said, "The Prentice problem." "Yes," Callum said. "You know about the Yellowstone County investments." "Fitch told me." "Then you know that challenging the judge directly is a trap. It looks like bad faith, it poisons the jury pool in any subsequent proceeding, and Prentice will use it to delay the case by 6 months minimum." She folded her hands on the documents. "What we do instead is make the evidentiary record so clean and so complete that any ruling Prentice makes against admissibility can be appealed to the territorial court in Helena within 30 days. And we make certain Prentice knows we know that. You can do that. I can do that." She looked at the incident log. "The harassment documentation is valuable, not because it proves fraud, it doesn't, directly, but because it demonstrates that someone with knowledge of the fraud believes these documents are genuine enough to be worth suppressing by other means. That speaks to provenance." Rosalind was sitting to the side as she had been in Horace's office, present and quiet. Cord glanced at her. "You wrote the incident log." "With Mr. Rourke's account. Your name is on the witness line." "Yes." Cord looked at her steadily. "You understand that Crowell will attempt to characterize your involvement as personally motivated. Vane family interest in undermining a former family attorney." "He can attempt it." Rosalind met her eyes. "I'll testify to what I observed. The documents speak for themselves without me." "They do," Cord agreed, "but juries and judges respond to people they believe, and you're easier to believe than Crowell." She looked back at Callum. "I want to take a deposition from Garveth before the hearing. His signed statement is good. His voice in a room is better." "He'll do it," Callum said. He was confident of that. The man who had handed over the statement with the surveying instrument, watching from the shelf, was a man who had decided to finish what he'd started. Cord stayed 2 days, going over every detail of the case with the thoroughness of someone who had been burned once by a detail she hadn't examined and had never made the same mistake again. On the second evening, she sat at the table after the work was done and drank coffee and looked out the window at the dark line of the eastern fence. 80 acres, she said. "Yes." "And water access along the creek boundary that the restored line would confirm." "Yes." She looked at the fence in the dark. "This ranch could be something." "That's the plan," Callum said. She looked at him. "Most men in your position would have taken the money. Most men didn't spend 15 years saving for it." Cord was quiet a moment. Then she looked at Rosalind. "And you came here to buy it." Rosalind held her gaze. I came here to deliver a purchase offer. That's different. Cord's expression shifted just slightly. Yes, she said. It is.
The
morning before the Prentice hearing, Crowell made his last play. He came alone. That was the first thing that was different. No 5 men, no deliberate arrangement of horses to block the gate. He came through in the gray pre-dawn light, a single rider on a gray horse, and he stopped outside the barn where Callum was doing the early feeding. Callum straightened and looked at him. I'm not here with an offer, Crowell said. He sounded tired. Not the performance of tired, actually tired, in the way a man sounds when he's been awake too long working a problem that won't solve itself. I want to talk. Gate's still on my property. I know it is. Crowell dismounted. He stood with the reins in his hands and looked older than he had the first morning he'd ridden through with his folded paper and his 3 men. Tomorrow's hearing, Prentice will rule in my favor on the admissibility motion. Maybe. Probably, Crowell said. He has reasons to. We'll appeal within 30 days. Something shifted in Crowell's face. He'd known Cord was there then. He'd probably known within a day of her arrival. Helena will take 4 months. Your second winter alone here, short of resources, with an appeal pending and no resolution on the boundary. Callum said nothing. He kept his eyes on Crowell's face. Walk away from the boundary claim, Crowell said. Not the ranch. Keep the ranch. Withdraw the boundary filing, return the documents to my client, and you keep your 240 acres in peace. No more incidents at your fence line. No more harassment. You run your operation, Vane's land stays as it is, and everyone gets through this without 4 more months of attrition. Your client, Callum said. Vane fired you. Crowell's jaw tightened. I have interests of my own in this resolution. Because Garveth signed a statement. A pause. Garveth is an old man who can be persuaded that his memory of events isn't reliable. He signed the statement in front of me. He read it back himself. He made corrections. That's not a man with an unreliable memory. Callum set down the bucket he'd been carrying, and Vane's providing his own sworn account to Cord before the hearing. That's not my doing. That's Horace Vane deciding what kind of man he wants to be at 61 years old, and there's nothing you can offer him to change it. Crowell stood in the cold. Something went out of his face. Not the authority, that was already gone, but the last of the calculation. What was left underneath was something closer to a man who has finally arrived at the wall he's been walking toward for 12 years. The Haller family, Callum said. You know Vane's attorney contacted them. I heard. The older daughter is still alive. She's 43, lives in Great Falls. Horace has made her an offer of compensation that her own attorney is reviewing. Callum watched him. Whatever happens tomorrow, that's going forward, and that's the part that doesn't stay quiet. Crowell looked at the ground. He looked at his horse. He looked back at Callum with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on a problem where every column comes out the same way. You're not going to withdraw, he said. No. Crowell gathered his reins. He mounted in the slow, deliberate way of a man feeling his age. He went and looked at the eastern fence line. At the repaired posts, the restored water channel, the dark line of boundary that tomorrow a judge would be asked to rule on. You know what the worst part is, Crowell said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that comes out of a man who's been holding it for a while and is done with the holding. I've handled 100 arrangements like that survey. Boundary lines, water rights, title questions. All of them legal enough on the surface. All of them serving men like Vane who needed results and didn't want to know the process. He looked at Callum. You're the first one I've encountered who went into the ground and found the mechanism. The mechanism was in a well on my property, Callum said. You put it there. Crowell did, the man said. And then, strange and quiet. I'm not sure I know where Lucian Crowell ends and I begin anymore. He turned his horse and rode out the gate. Callum watched him go and felt something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't sympathy, but occupied some territory between them that he didn't have a name for. He went back to feeding the horses. Rosalind arrived an hour later. She came through the gate and found him at the eastern fence, checking the posts, doing the morning check he'd been doing every day since the harassment started. Crowell was here, she said. She'd passed him on the road, apparently. Yes. What did he want? To offer a version of things where he doesn't lose everything. She stood beside him at the fence post and looked at the eastern line. Tomorrow the hearing. Tomorrow Cord in Prentice's court with the original deed and Garveth's statement and Horace Vane's sworn account. Tomorrow, whatever Prentice decided, and then whatever came after that. You should sleep, she said, before tonight. Probably. Will you? He looked at her. At the woman who had arrived through this gate with her father's money and had spent 5 weeks learning the bones of his ranch and had put her name on a witness log and written a letter to an attorney in Billings and sat in her father's study and said, "I'm not finished," in a voice that moved mountains, one careful sentence at a time. "I'll sleep," he said. She nodded. She pulled her gloves tighter and looked out across the eastern pasture. The reclaimed grass, the dark line of the creek, the 80 acres that the court might give back tomorrow or might take another 4 months to give back after that, but that the documents proved had never stopped belonging here. "It's good land," she said. "Best in the valley," Callum said. She looked at him sideways. "I know," she said. "I told you that the first time I saw it." She hadn't exactly, but close enough. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the fence wire, and Callum turned the collar of his coat up, and they stood together at the boundary of what he'd built and what he stood to recover, and neither of them moved toward the house, because the morning was cold and clear and the land was right there, and some mornings that's enough reason to stay exactly where you are. Prentice ruled against admissibility. Cord had predicted it. She'd set it across Callum's table the night before the hearing with the particular flatness of someone delivering a weather forecast. They don't have power to change. Not defeat, not resignation, just the shape of what was coming and what came after it. Prentice ruled the original deed inadmissible on the grounds that provenance from a sealed well on property that had changed hands twice could not be established without independent corroboration, and he ruled Garveth's signed statement inadmissible on the grounds that a statement taken without formal legal oversight lacked procedural standing in his court. He did not rule on Horace Vane's sworn account. That was the tell. Cord caught it in the room, and Callum caught it from her expression, and they said nothing about it until they were outside on the courthouse steps in the cold November air. "He wouldn't touch Vane's statement," Cord said. "He ruled on the deed and on Garveth and left Vane's account sitting on the record without addressing it. Because ruling against Vane's sworn account is a different category of decision," Callum said. "It implicates Prentice's own history with Crowell's arrangements. He can rule against a surveyor's recollection and a deed found in a well. He cannot rule against a sworn statement from the largest cattle operator in the county without inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny he's been avoiding for 20 years. Cord pulled her coat tighter. "We file the appeal in Helena today, not this week. Today." 30 days. Callum said. "You said 30 days. I said within 30 days. I mean today." She looked at him. "Prentice's ruling is actually cleaner for us than a mixed decision would have been. I excluded everything and left Vane standing. That's an appealable record. Helena gets the whole picture." Rosalind had been standing 2 steps down, listening. She turned now. "Crowell will know within the hour. Yes, he'll think he won. Let him think it," Cord said. "Men who think they've won stop being careful, and Crowell needs to stop being careful long enough to make his next mistake, because he will make one." She looked at Callum. "Go back to the ranch. Keep the incident log current. I'm filing this afternoon, and I'll send word when Helena confirms receipt." She went back inside. Callum stood on the steps and looked out at the main street of Holt County's courthouse town. The feed merchant, the livery, the hotel where Cord had a room. The ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what had been decided inside the building behind him in the last 2 hours. Rosalind came and stood beside him. "Helena will take it," she said. "Cord seems to think so." "Cord knows so. She argued the Yellowstone appeal in Helena. She knows the presiding judge." She paused. 4 months, she said. 4 months. That's a second winter on short resources. "I know what 4 months is," Callum said, not sharply, just with the weariness of a man doing arithmetic that doesn't resolve the way he needs it to. "I can manage." She looked at him. She had something on her face that she was deciding whether to say. He'd learned that expression over 5 weeks of working beside her. The specific quality of a thought being weighed before it was released. "There's a solution," she said. "Not Vane's money. Not a gift. A business arrangement." She turned to face him more directly. "Cinder Creek needs winter resources. Capital for feed, for labor, for the legal cost Cord's contingency doesn't cover. Vane's operation has more livestock than our current eastern rotation can handle efficiently. If Cinder Creek's eastern pasture were brought into a formal grazing agreement with Vane's herd, on land that's still legally under dispute, on land that Horace Vane's own sworn testimony confirms should be under dispute in Cinder Creek's favor, he's not going to send cattle to graze land he's testified doesn't belong to him." She held his gaze. "The agreement would be between your operation and his." A fair rate per head, paid monthly. You get winter income and he gets supplemental grazing access on land that I already own, Callum said. The 240 acres, not the contested 80. Your south pasture and the creek bottom. Yes. She paused. It's your land, your terms. He pays market rate or above, and both parties have the right to end the arrangement on 30 days' notice. Callum looked at the street. A wagon went by with a load of winter hay, someone else's winter hay, stacked tight and clean. Why does he agree to that arrangement? Callum said. He could wait 4 months for the appeal to resolve and then negotiate from there. Because I asked him to. She said it simply. And because I told him that a man who testified against his own financial interest in the interest of setting something right ought to follow through in ways that cost him something ongoing, not just once. She paused. He agreed. Callum looked at her. When? Yesterday evening, before the hearing. She held his gaze without apology. I know you'd have told me not to. You know why? I know you'd say it compromises your independence, that it makes Cinder Creek's survival contingent on a Vane decision. She didn't look away. But your independence is already contingent on Cord winning in Helena, and on Garveth not changing his account, and on Prentice not finding another way to interfere, and on a dozen other things you don't control. Adding one arrangement that you can terminate on 30 days' notice isn't surrender. It's how things that are worth building actually get built. The cold wind came down the street and moved through the gap between the buildings, and Callum stood in it with all of that. She was right. He knew she was right. The knowing sat alongside the particular pride of a man who had built everything he had from his own wages and his own hands, and the two things were not reconcilable in a way that felt clean, and he was tired enough from the morning's hearing that he was done pretending they needed to be. Market rate or above, he said. Above, she said. I was specific about that. 30 days notice on either side. Written into the agreement. He looked at the courthouse behind them. He looked at the street. He looked at Rosalind. All right, he said. She nodded. Nothing more. She turned and went to get her horse from the livery, and Callum stood another moment on the courthouse steps and then followed her. The grazing agreement was signed before the week was out. Vane's cattle came to the south pasture in 2 groups, managed by 2 of his hands who arrived each morning and were quiet, professional men who treated the work as work and didn't carry any of the political weight of the months preceding it into their daily operations. Callum worked alongside them without incident. The income arrived monthly as agreed, and it was enough, barely enough, but enough, to carry the winter costs that Cord's arrangement didn't cover and keep the incident log current and maintain the fence line without attrition. December came in hard. The temperature dropped below 0 for the first week and stayed there, and the snow came on the 14th in the kind of quantity that ended arguments about whether winter had arrived. Callum was alone in the evenings, which was the same as it had always been, except now it felt different in a way he didn't examine too directly. Rosalind came 4 mornings a week, weather permitting, and 2 mornings when weather made it impractical, and she came anyway. They worked on the barn's remaining structural weakness, a section of east wall that had been inadequately framed when the original structure went up and had been losing ground to wind loading for years. It required pulling sections of siding and reframing from the inside, which was cold work and close work, and they did it together over the course of several weeks in a companionable silence broken by conversation that had gradually stopped being about the ranch and started being about other things. She told him about her mother, not in a prepared way, not as a subject she'd decided to address, but in the way the important things came out when you were doing something with your hands and your mind was partly occupied and partly free. In pieces across days assembled without intention. Her mother had been the daughter of a territorial judge from upstate. She'd been capable and restrained and had understood Horace's ambitions without sharing them, and she had died 3 winters ago from a fever that turned to pneumonia faster than anyone expected. Rosalind had been with her at the end and hadn't left the main house for 2 weeks after, and had never discussed either fact with her father because he grieved privately and she'd learned to do the same. She would have liked this, Rosalind said one morning, looking at the framing they'd repaired. It was the kind of statement that had more behind it than the surface word. The barn, Callum said. The work. She ran her hand along the new framing. She always said the only things worth having were the ones you made or repaired yourself. My father used to say that was easy to believe when you'd never gone without. She paused. I think she was right, and he was also right. They were both always right about different parts of the same thing. Callum drove the next nail and thought about that. That's most marriages, probably. She looked at him. A beat. Yes, she said. Probably. He didn't look at her. He drove the next nail. But the quality of the silence after that was different. And they both understood it was different. And neither of them addressed it directly because the work was there and the cold was there, and some things took the time they needed without being pushed. Helena confirmed the appeal on a Tuesday in January. Cord's letter arrived via the county post, and Callum read it at the kitchen table and read it again and set it down and sat with it for a moment before going out to find Rosalind in the barn. She was checking the hay inventory, which was something they both tracked carefully given the costs involved. She looked at his face when he came through the door. "Helena," she said, "confirmed receipt scheduled for territorial court docket in March." She set down her tally book. March is 2 months. Cord's going up in person. She said the full evidentiary record, including Prentice's selective ruling on the documents, is being presented in its entirety. He paused. She said Prentice's decision to leave Vane's sworn account untouched was the best thing that could have happened for the appeal. Rosalind let out a breath. Not dramatic, contained, the way she handled relief as much as everything else. "March," she said again. "March." She looked at the haystacks, did the calculation without needing to speak it out loud. March was manageable. Tight, but manageable. They both knew the numbers. "Crowell," she said. "Cord's letter says the Territorial Prosecutor's Office has opened a preliminary inquiry. Garveth's statement, the original letter, Vane's account. They're examining whether there's a basis for fraud charges." Callum watched her. "It doesn't affect the boundary appeal. It runs separately. But it takes Crowell's attention. It takes his attorney's attention, which is a different thing from having his attention." He paused. "Cord says he's hired representation from out of state, which means he's taking it seriously." Rosalind looked at the barn door. Through it, the snow-covered yard, the white-weighted fence lines, the eastern pasture under its winter blanket. Somewhere under all of that, 78 yards of boundary waiting to be put right. "We should tell my father," she said. "You can tell him." She looked at him. "He'd like to hear it from you." Callum looked at her steadily. "He respects you," she said. "Not as flattery, as information. He doesn't give that easily, and he doesn't perform it. He's asked me twice in the last month how things are going here, and when I tell him, he listens the way he listens when the answer matters. He's asked about the ranch. He's asked about you." She held his gaze. "Don't make me explain the difference. You know the difference." Callum knew the difference. They rode to the Vane main house that afternoon, and Horace met them in the workroom with the maps and the scarred desk. The same room as before, but different somehow. The weight of the intervening months in it, the decisions that had been made in it, and what those decisions had cost and what they'd changed. Horace read Cord's letter. He set it down and looked at the wall in the way he did when he was processing something he'd expected and that still arrived with some weight. "March," he said. "March," Callum confirmed, "and the prosecutor's inquiry." "Running separately." Horace nodded. He looked at Callum. "Crowell sent a letter last week, through his new attorney." He picked it up from the desk and held it without opening it. "He's claiming that materials from his time representing this company are covered under attorney-client privilege, and that the sworn statement I provided to Cord constitutes a waiver of that privilege." He set the letter back down. "My attorney says it's a delay tactic. That the privilege question has a legal answer, and the answer is not in Crowell's favor." "But it costs time," Callum said. "Everything costs time." Horace looked at him. "I've spent a great deal of my life purchasing time with money, Mr. Rourke. It's an interesting experience to find that the current problem doesn't resolve that way." Callum looked at the letter on the desk. "What does he want under the legal language?" Horace was quiet a moment. "He wants my testimony withdrawn, in exchange for his silence on certain arrangements that he characterizes as mutually understood business practices." He said it with the measured flatness of someone reading from a ledger they'd rather not be reading from. "There are things in my history that Crowell knows about that would not benefit from examination." The room held that. Rosalind, who had been sitting to the side as always, was very still. "How serious," she said. She directed it to her father, and her voice was controlled, but it was asking something real. Horace looked at his daughter. The look that passed between them was long and had decades in it. "Not criminal," he said, "but not things I'm proud of. Land arrangements where I looked the other way about how they resolved. Water access deals where I knew the other party's position was weaker than it should have been, and I used that." He paused. "Not fraud, but the next county over from fraud in some cases. And Crowell knows which counties," Callum said. "Crowell built the map." Horace picked up the letter and set it back down again, a gesture that had the quality of a man trying to put something in a place that doesn't exist. He's suggesting that if I withdraw my testimony, he'll take his knowledge to whatever resolution he finds in his own legal situation without implicating the Vane Company's prior practices. And if you don't withdraw, he'll use what he has. Horace looked at Callum. I won't withdraw. I want you to know that. It's not a decision I'm still making, but I wanted you to know what it will likely cost. Callum held the older man's gaze. He thought about the man who had ridden into his yard 11 days into his ownership with the gate of authority he'd expected to find in his daughter, and the man who had been quiet at a table in the same room when the boundary documents were laid in front of him, and the man who was sitting here now telling him that Crowell had leverage and that the leverage was not going to change the decision. It'll cost what it costs, Callum said. You already decided that matters. Something moved in Horace's expression. Brief. Rosalind was right about you, he said. She usually is, Callum said. Horace made a sound that might have been a laugh in a man who hadn't recently practiced the motion. February ran cold and then colder still, and in the last week of the month it was Rosalind who noticed the wind shifting south and said the temperature was going to break soon and that the early grass along the creek bottom might show in the first week of March. She was right about the temperature. She was right about the grass. And it was in the first week of March, with the frost coming out of the ground and the creek running clear and fast with snowmelt, that the hay barn on Vane's North Range caught fire. Callum saw the smoke from his eastern fence line, where he was checking the posts in the thaw-softened ground. A column of it, dark and heavy and wrong, rising from the direction of Vane's North Range buildings. He was on his horse inside of a minute and riding before he'd fully assembled the thought into decision. He smelled it before he saw it, the particular smell of burning hay, dry and dense and enormous. And then the building itself came into view, and it was fully involved, the whole north face sheeted in fire with the wind pushing it east toward the stable block where the horses were kept. Vane's ranch hands were already there, a dozen of them, working a bucket line from the water trough to the barn walls with the coordinated desperation of people who understood that what they were doing wasn't going to save the barn and were doing it anyway because the alternative was to stand and watch. Callum came off his horse at the stable and got there in time to understand the problem before anyone had to tell him. The stable held 16 horses. The fire was moving faster than the bucket line, and the ranch hands at the barn couldn't leave the line without it collapsing entirely. He went to the stable door. The heat hit him before he touched the latch. Not from the stable, from the adjacent wall of the barn, which was throwing heat sideways in waves that made the air itself unstable. Inside the stable, the horses were beyond frantic, kicking and screaming in the particular register of animals who can smell fire through walls. He got the first two out himself, one in each hand, half dragged through the door and into the yard where they bolted, and he let them bolt because at least in the yard they were breathing. He went back in. Two more. The smoke was thicker on the third trip, and his eyes were watering badly, and he could hear the barn's east wall beginning to give way. A deep, structural sound, the kind you feel in your chest before your ears register it. He came out with the fifth and sixth and turned back, and Rosalind was there. She'd arrived from somewhere. He hadn't seen her come, and she had two horses by their halters, and she was moving with the same certainty she moved with in the barn at Cinder Creek. How many left, she said. 10, maybe 9. He was already back at the door. Stay on the east side. The wall's going... I know which side the wall's on. She went through the door. They worked it together. The smoke was thick enough now that he was mostly navigating by feel and the sound of the horses, and Rosalind moved through it beside him, and they got horses out in groups of 2, both of them, neither counting out loud because counting out loud took air they didn't have to spare. The east wall of the barn came down on the 9th trip. It didn't come all at once. It gave in sections, the upper portion first, which sent a cascade of burning material into the space between the barn and the stable and threw a wave of heat and sparks across the stable yard that scattered the rescued horses again and drove the bucket line back 50 yards. Callum was at the stable door when it came down. The concussion of it knocked him sideways and he hit the door frame and went down on one knee in the dirt. He heard Rosalind's voice before he got back up. She was at the far end of the stable, still inside, with the last 2 horses, and the smoke from the fallen wall section was pouring through the gap in the stable's east-facing window, and the air in there was no longer usable. He went back in. He found her by the sound. She had both horses, but one had panicked and was pulling against her with its full weight, and she was holding it with both hands and losing ground. He got to the animal's head, put his hands where hers were, and shifted his weight and drove it forward by force and momentum rather than control. All 4 of them through the stable door and out into the yard and the air. He didn't let go of the horse until it stopped pulling. Then he stood in the yard with his hands on his knees and breathed. The barn was gone. The entire north face was collapsed, and what was left was burning itself out in the February cold with the wind pushing the smoke east across Vane's grazing land. All 16 horses were in the yard. Some had gone over the fence line. All were alive. Callum straightened up. His chest hurt in a specific way that wasn't from the impact against the doorframe. His eyes were streaming, and his throat felt like he'd been breathing chalk. He looked at Rosalind. She was standing 10 feet away, holding her own knees, her hair down from its usual arrangement, her coat dark with smoke. She was looking at the horses scattered across the yard and the fence line and counting them, the way she counted everything, systematically, without drama. 16, she said. Yes. She looked at him. Something broke across her face, not composed, not controlled, just her. Don't ever do that again, she said. He looked at her. Go back in, she said. On the third trip, when the wall was going, don't. She wasn't crying. She looked like someone who had just come through the far side of something that had scared her badly and had decided that being scared was less important than saying the truth. Because I would have come back for you and neither of us would have gotten out. The yard was loud around them. Horses, men, the sound of the fire finishing itself. None of it touched the 10 feet between where they stood. I wasn't going to leave them, he said. I know that. She crossed the distance. She put both hands against his chest, not gently, and looked at him. I know that about you. I've known it since the fence corner, but... She stopped, took a breath. But it's different when I'm standing outside and you're inside and the wall is coming down. He put his hand over hers, both of them. His hands were shaking, which he'd been aware of and had been attributing to the cold. Rosalind, he said. Don't say something careful, she said. I'm not in the mood for something careful. I wasn't going to, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her forehead down against his shoulder and stayed there, and he kept his hands over hers, and they stood in the burned yard with the horses scattered around them, and the smoke going east on the wind, and the late winter sun making no warmth but plenty of light. Horace found them there. He came across the yard with two of his hands, and he looked at the barn and at the horses and at the two of them, and his face moved through several things before settling into something that Callum recognized as a man arriving at an understanding he'd been approaching for a while. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the horses. He counted them. 16, Callum said. Horace looked at him. He looked at his daughter. Both of you went in. Yes, Rosalind said. Horace was quiet. He looked at the burned barn. The structure failure, the east wall, that was coming before the fire started. I knew that wall needed work. He said it flat. I kept moving it back because there was always something more pressing. He looked at Callum. If I'd fixed it when I should have, the fire would have found another wall, Callum said. Weather like we had last month, lightning and dry hay. Nothing about the wall caused this. It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it, but Horace looked at him with an expression that understood the gift for what it was. My physician, Horace said. He should look at you both before you ride anywhere. I'm fine, Callum said. Your voice tells me something different. Horace held his gaze. The physician. Then we'll talk about what comes next. The physician came and confirmed what Callum already suspected. Smoke in the lungs, the kind that made breathing work that it shouldn't be, that would ease in days but needed rest to ease. He was told no heavy labor for 2 weeks minimum. He was told the kind of cold that drove Montana in February would make the recovery slower if he was exposed to it without cause. He rode home to Cinder Creek that evening anyway, because it was his property and his horses needed feeding and there was no one else to do it. But Rosalind came with him. She said nothing about it. She rode beside him to the gate and through it and put both horses up herself, while he sat on the porch steps and breathed carefully. Then she went inside and made something to eat on his stove and brought it out and sat on the steps beside him. They ate in the cold. Your feather, Callum said, knows where I am. Is he... He said to tell you the grazing arrangement terms stand regardless of the barn, and that the lumber from the burned structure will be salvaged and stacked and is available to Cinder Creek if it can be used. She ate another bite. He said it without me asking. Callum looked at the eastern pasture in the dark. The snow was coming off it in patches, the dark grass showing through in long, irregular shapes like something emerging. That's not charity, he said. No, she said, it's not. He sat with that and with the ache in his chest and with the woman beside him on the cold steps of a house he'd built his life around owning. And the night was clear and the stars were out over the valley and the creek was running with snowmelt and somewhere under 4 feet of winter soft ground. The boundary of what belonged to him was waiting for March and a territorial court in Helena to put it exactly where it had always been. He didn't know how to say the thing he wanted to say. He hadn't practiced it and he wasn't built for the practiced version anyway. "I'm glad you were there," he said. "Today." She looked at him. "I know," she said, "not just for the horses." She was quiet a moment. "I know that too." The creek moved in the dark. The horses shifted in the barn. The cold sat on everything and made it real and exact, and Callum Rourke sat on his porch steps on his own land and breathed carefully and understood that some things that matter most don't announce themselves. They just arrive, like the grass through the snow when the ground is finally ready. The 2 weeks of rest the physician had prescribed turned into 11 days because Callum was not built for 2 weeks of rest, and everyone involved understood that by day 4. He did the lighter work, feeding, checking water, the kind of maintenance that didn't require lifting or extended cold exposure. And Rosalind did the rest without being asked and without making a performance of it. She stayed nights twice that first week, in the arrangement that had developed without announcement. She took the extra room that Callum had never had cause to furnish properly, sleeping on a cot he'd found in the barn, and in the morning she was up before him and had the stove going, and neither of them treated this as remarkable because making it remarkable would have required a conversation they were both still approaching from the sides. On the 8th day, Cord wrote from Helena. The territorial court had scheduled the appeal hearing for the 14th of March. She wrote that the presiding judge had reviewed the submitted record, including Prentice's selective ruling, and had requested that Horace Vane's sworn statement be entered into evidence directly, bypassing Prentice's court entirely. She wrote that this was unusual. She wrote that unusual, in this instance, meant the court was taking it seriously. Callum read the letter at the table and then read it again and set it down. Rosalind was at the stove. She turned and looked at his face, and he held up the letter, and she crossed the room and read it over his shoulder. She straightened up. The 14th. 10 days. She thought for a moment. Cord will need Garveth and Helena. I know. I'll ride to him today. Your lungs are fine for riding. He looked up at her. I'm not sending someone else to ask Garveth to travel for this. She looked at him for a moment. She understood why. Some things you asked in person, or you didn't have the right to ask them at all. I'll come with you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. She went back to the stove. I'll come with you. They rode to Garveth's house in the late morning, the snow mostly gone from the road now, with only the shaded patches holding it, the ground soft and dark beneath. The broken windmill was still in the yard. The house was quiet in the way it had been the first time. Garveth opened the door before they knocked. He'd seen them coming up the road, apparently, and he stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who had been waiting for whatever came next and had made his peace with not knowing what form it would take. Helena, he said. March 14th, Callum said. The court wants you there, not just the statement. You, in the room. The old man looked at them. He looked at the road behind them, which was empty. He looked at the surveying instrument on the shelf inside, which Callum could see through the open door. I'm 78 years old, Garveth said. I haven't traveled to Helena in 9 years. I know. The trip would take 2 days each way. I know that too. Garveth was quiet. He looked at Rosalind. It was the first time he'd seen her in person, and he assessed her the way old men assess things, fully, unhurried. You're Vane's daughter, he said. Yes. Your father's providing testimony. Yes. Against his own financial interest. Against the fraud that was conducted in his name, Rosalind said, which isn't quite the same thing, but close enough. Garveth looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at Callum. I'll need train fare. I'll cover it, Callum said, and someone to look after the place while I'm gone. There's a mare in the back. I'll arrange that, Rosalind said. The old man nodded once. He stepped back from the door. Come in. I'll need to write some things down before I go, things I want to remember to say. You can tell me if I'm leaving anything out. They spent 2 hours at his table, and when they left, he had 4 pages of careful notes in his surveyor's hand, and the train arrangements were settled, and a neighbor boy was agreed upon for the mare. He stood in the door as they mounted and looked at them with something in his face that was the complicated expression of a man who has spent 12 years with a wrong sitting inside him and can finally feel the dimensions of the space it will leave. Thank you, Callum said. You keep saying that, Garveth said. I keep telling you, I'm the one who drew the false line. He paused. Let's just get it fixed. They wrote to Helena on the 12th, Callum and Rosalind and Garveth, with Cord meeting them at the station. Horace came separately with his new attorney, and they arranged rooms at the same hotel without coordinating it, which resulted in Horace and Callum crossing paths in the lobby and acknowledging each other with the particular nod of men who have arrived at a mutual understanding that required no further words. The territorial court was a different room from Prentice's courthouse in every sense that mattered. The presiding judge was a woman in her early 60s named Hartwell, which was unusual enough in 1890 Montana that Crowell's out-of-state attorney visibly reassessed his strategy when she entered. She had the manner of someone who had been the most prepared person in every room she'd ever entered and had stopped finding that surprising. Cord argued the evidentiary foundation in the morning session. She laid it out with the clean, cumulative logic she'd described at Callum's table: the original deed, Garveth's account, the surveyor's own testimony about the payment and the relocated line, and Horace Vane's sworn statement entered directly into the territorial record without Prentice's exclusionary filter. Then she entered the incident log. The pattern of harassment, the fence posts, the water channel, the slow riders, documented, dated, signed. She told the court that this pattern of interference demonstrated that the opposing party had sufficient knowledge of the document's legitimacy to attempt their practical suppression through physical means. She called it consciousness of guilt, and she used that phrase once, precisely, and moved on. Crowell's attorney challenged Garveth's credibility on cross-examination. Garveth sat in the witness chair with his 4 pages of notes folded in his coat pocket and answered every question in the careful, precise voice of a man who had done technical work for 40 years and knew how to describe it. He didn't perform remorse. He stated what he had done, the date he had done it, the amount he had been paid, and the name of the man who had given him the payment. He stated these things with the accuracy of a surveyor describing measurements, and the accuracy was itself the most convincing thing in the room. When the cross-examination suggested his memory might be impaired by age, Garveth reached into his pocket and produced the original surveying notes from the 1877 boundary work, his own field notes in his own hand, with the measurements recorded and the correction penciled in at the margin in a different ink, a correction that corresponded exactly to the relocated line. He had not mentioned these notes to Callum or to Cord. He had carried them in his house for 12 years, apparently, in the same drawer as the surveying instrument on the shelf, and had brought them without being asked because he was a man who had once taken pride in his documentation and knew what documentation was worth. The cross-examination ended shortly after that. Horace testified in the afternoon. He sat in the same chair Garveth had occupied and answered questions in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was not going to be moved from it. He confirmed that Crowell had handled the survey arrangements. He confirmed that he had been informed the boundary dispute was resolved in his favor and had not requested a detailed account of the resolution. He confirmed that he had subsequently discovered irregularities and had terminated Crowell's representation as a result. He was asked whether he stood to lose financially from a restoration of the original boundary. Yes, he said, approximately 80 acres of productive grazing land. And you're testifying in favor of that restoration. I'm testifying to what I know to be accurate, Horace said. The financial consequence is separate from the accuracy. He paused. They should have been separate 12 years ago. They weren't. I'm correcting that now. Callum was sitting in the gallery. He watched Horace Vane say that to a territorial court judge in Helena, Montana, and understood something that the preceding months had been assembling in pieces, that the capacity to change was not reserved for the young or the poor or the people who had the least to lose. It was available to anyone who wanted it badly enough to pay its actual price, which was almost always something you'd been holding on to for a long time, under the impression that you couldn't afford to let it go. Horace could afford to let it go. He'd always been able to. He just needed someone to show him what it was costing him to keep holding it. Judge Hartwell recessed in the late afternoon and delivered her ruling the following morning. She restored the original boundary line in full. She ordered a county resurvey at the Vane Company's expense. She admitted the original deed and Garveth's statement into the permanent territorial record and issued a formal notation regarding Prentice's procedural conduct that stopped short of censure, but was specific enough that Prentice would be reading it carefully for the rest of his career. On the matter of Lucian Crowell, she noted that the evidence presented established a clear basis for referral to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for formal investigation of fraud and conduct unbecoming a licensed attorney, and she made that referral in writing from the bench. Crowell was not in the courtroom. He had been represented throughout by his out-of-state attorney, and the absence was its own statement, and everyone in the room understood what statement it was. Callum sat in the gallery and held the ruling in his head and let it settle into the shape of what it actually meant. Not the legal language, not the procedural record, but the plain fact of it. 78 acres. His. The creek boundary restored. Cinder Creek, all of it, running from the southwestern corner to the northeastern edge of the original deed, belonging entirely to the man who had bought it and fought for it and refused every invitation to let it go. He looked at Rosalind beside him. She was looking at the judge's bench with the expression she wore when something resolved correctly. Not triumphant, just settled, the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been worked honestly arriving at an honest answer. She turned and found him looking at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the almost was enough. The ride back from Helena took 2 days, and they rode most of it in a companionable quiet that had earned itself over months of working and arguing and standing at fence lines in the cold. Garveth traveled by train back to his house and his mare. Horace's party rode separately, ahead of them by half a day, which felt deliberate on Horace's part and was probably considerate. On the second day, coming down from the high country toward the Holt County valley floor, with Cinder Creek visible in the distance and the early spring light making the grass along the creek bottom look almost gold, Rosalind brought her horse alongside his and rode there without speaking for a mile. Then she said, "What happens now?" It wasn't about the ranch. He understood it wasn't about the ranch. "I have a resurvey to oversee," he said, "and a fence line to move 78 yards east, and a season's worth of work that got deferred for the legal business." And he looked at the creek in the distance, at the shape of the valley, at the way the land lay between the mountains on both sides, and collected the light. "I think you should stay," he said. She was quiet. "Not as a visitor," he said. "Not on 4 mornings a week. Stay." The horses walked. The road went down toward the valley floor, and the spring air was cold still, but with the particular quality of cold that's running out of conviction, the cold of a season ending rather than holding. "You're not a man who says things he doesn't mean," she said. "No." "Or things he hasn't thought through." "No." She looked at the valley. He could see her working through the shape of it the way she worked through every practical problem, systematically, without rushing, getting to the real dimensions of it. "My father will have opinions," she said. "He'll manage. He'll have a version of how it should look, a wedding, an arrangement. He'll want to be involved in the planning of it. Then let him be involved. It won't kill either of us." She looked at him sideways. "You've thought about the wedding." "I've thought about what comes after the wedding." He held her gaze. "The wedding is just the day." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What I bring to this isn't money. You know that. I know that. My father would give us capital if we asked. I won't ask unless you agree to it, and I'd rather we didn't need to. But the land knowledge, the cattle rotation, the water management, that's mine, and it's real, and it'll be worth more to Cinder Creek over 20 years than any sum Horace could write on a paper." "I've known that since the fence corner," Callum said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Something in her face moved. Something that had been carefully maintained throughout the winter and the hearings and the fire and the cold morning on the porch steps, moved and settled into something simpler and more exposed. "All right," she said, quietly, the same way she'd said everything that mattered. "All right," he said. They rode down into the valley together and through the gate of Cinder Creek Ranch, and the horses went to the barn knowing the way, and Callum stood in the yard and looked at the place in the early spring light. The barn with its repaired walls and its new roof section, the south fence running plumb and true, the working well with its clean stone casing, the creek cutting through the valley bottom, and felt the particular weight of a thing that has been fought for arriving in its fullness. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like belonging. Those are different things, and most people confuse them, and the difference is that victory ends and belonging continues. They were married in May, on a Saturday, outside at Cinder Creek, because Rosalind said she'd spent enough of her life in rooms that belonged to other people's occasions. It was a small arrangement. Cord came from Billings, Fitch came from the county seat, Garveth came from his house on the South Road, and Horace came with 3 of his ranch hands who stood at the back and looked like they weren't sure where to put their hats. There was no minister. A county justice of the peace named Birch, who was also the town's notary and part-time postmaster, said the words that were required to make it legal. He said them efficiently and without ornamentation, which suited both parties. Horace did not give Rosalind away. That phrase had never entered the conversation and would not have survived the conversation if it had. He walked beside her from the house to where Callum stood near the old fence corner. The same post, the same diagonal brace, reset now 3 times and still standing. And when they arrived, he stopped walking, and Rosalind kept walking, and when she reached Callum, she turned back and looked at her father. Horace looked at his daughter. He looked at the cowboy who had refused every offer he'd sent through every intermediary and had opened a sealed well and held a fence post through 2 incidents of harassment, and walked into a burning stable 3 times and turned down his money and won his land. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, acquired the one thing Horace had never thought to account for in his calculations. He walked forward and shook Callum's hand. He held it for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that only the 3 of them heard it. "I thought money was the thing that protected her. I was wrong about that." He stepped back. Birch said the words. Callum and Rosalind said the words that answered them. Fitch signed the document as witness. Garveth signed it beside him, in the careful hand of a man who had spent his life signing documents and was glad to have one more worth signing. Cord watched from beside the repaired fence and drank the whiskey someone had provided and looked at the valley with the expression of a woman calculating what Cinder Creek would be worth in 10 years if it was run the way it was about to be run. She calculated correctly, as it happened. The resurvey was completed in April, 6 weeks after the Helena ruling, by a county surveyor who came with 2 assistants and spent 3 days walking the original boundary measurements and confirmed them to within 2 yards of what the 1877 deed described. The new fence line was set in May, partly by Callum and partly by 2 of Vane's hands, who Horace sent without being asked and who Callum paid at fair rate from the grazing arrangement income that had carried the winter. The eastern pasture, all of it, the original 240 acres plus the restored 78, was seeded and fenced before the end of June. By August, it carried cattle in the rotation that Rosalind had planned on paper over the winter, a plan that accounted for the creek access and the soil moisture gradient she'd walked twice in snowmelt season to measure correctly. The cattle did well, better than the first-year projections, which were conservative because Rosalind built conservative projections and then argued for ambition inside the conservative margins. Crowell's case moved through the territorial prosecutor's office over the spring and into the summer. He was formally charged in July with fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and misconduct in the practice of law. His out-of-state attorney negotiated a resolution that included disbarment and restitution and avoided incarceration on the grounds of Crowell's age, which was 53, and his cooperation with the prosecutor's inquiry into related arrangements, several of which, it emerged, did not involve Horace Vane at all and were considerably more direct in their dishonesty. Horace's past practices, the ones Crowell had threatened to expose, were examined as part of the broader inquiry and found to fall, as Horace had described them, in the territory adjacent to fraud rather than inside it. His cooperation with the inquiry was noted. He was not charged. He paid a civil settlement to 2 parties whose arrangements had been structurally unfair, which his new attorney negotiated to a number that was honest without being ruinous. His reputation contracted somewhat. His respect in the county counterintuitively increased. Men who had been doing business in Holt County long enough to remember the Holler boundary dispute understood what it had cost Horace to walk it back, and that kind of understanding, once given, tends to stay. He came to Cinder Creek for Sunday meals through the summer, which became a pattern that nobody announced and nobody discontinued. He and Callum discussed cattle and grass and water with the particular ease of 2 men who had arrived at mutual respect through difficulty and found the difficulty had made the respect more durable than the easy kind. He and Rosalind talked for hours sometimes, the conversations they'd never had when she was growing up inside the operation he ran, and she watched from the outside of every decision. He was not a changed man in any dramatic sense. He was the same man, with more of his history accounted for, making different choices inside the same character, which is probably the most honest version of how people actually change when they change at all. The Holler daughters, both of them, as it turned out, since the younger one was located in Minnesota by Horace's attorney, received the compensation offer and accepted it through their own legal representatives. The older daughter, the one in Great Falls, wrote a letter to Horace that he showed to no one and that Rosalind learned about only when he mentioned it once, at a Sunday meal, in the particular way he mentioned things he was still absorbing, briefly, without looking at anyone directly, and then moving on. She didn't ask what the letter said. Some things are private in proportion to how much they cost. There is something that people who've never built anything from nothing tend to misunderstand about the people who have, and it's this. The building is not the hard part. The hard part is deciding what the thing is for. Callum Rourke had spent 15 years deciding. He'd decided in bunkhouses in Wyoming and on cold mornings in Colorado, and in the particular loneliness of belonging to land that belonged to someone else, and what he decided was not complicated. He wanted to own land that was his. He wanted to go to sleep on it, and wake up on it, and put his hands into its problems, and stand at its fence line and know that the fence was his fence, and the grass inside it was his grass, and no one could come through the gate with a folded paper and take it away. He got that. He fought for it, and he kept it, and the territorial court put it in the record with a judge's signature. But what he hadn't calculated, what no 15-year accounting in a tobacco tin under a bunk could have prepared him for, was that the land would matter differently when someone else understood it the way he did. That the fence line would mean something different when someone stood beside him at it. That the belonging he'd been working toward was not a solo condition. That it was, it turned out, a thing that doubled when it was shared with the right person. He couldn't have told you when he knew that, not a single moment, more like the way the grass comes back after winter. You don't see it returning, you just look one morning and it's there, and you understand it's been coming back for weeks, quietly, underneath the cold. Rosalind, for her part, had arrived at Cinder Creek believing she understood what she was coming for and understanding approximately half of it. She understood the land, the cattle, the practical machinery of what made a ranch work or fail. She had built that knowledge carefully and privately over years of watching her father's operation from the outside of every decision, and she'd known it was good knowledge even when no one in that operation was inclined to use it. What she hadn't understood, what 5 weeks of working alongside a man who listened because she was right, who didn't flatten her expertise into a category labeled woman who knows about ranching, who accepted help without debt and gave respect without calculation. What she hadn't understood was that there was a version of her life that didn't require her to operate at one remove from everything that mattered to her. She had spent 27 years being capable in the vicinity of consequences she wasn't allowed to influence. She spent the rest of her life being capable at the center of them. That mattered. It mattered in ways that are difficult to quantify and easy to underestimate, and that compounds silently, over decades, into the difference between a life that was lived and a life that was endured in comfortable circumstances. Years later, enough years that the fence post Callum had originally set wrong and Rosalind had corrected was into its second replacement. The wood gone soft and replaced, but the same corners still braced the right direction. A family came to look at some cattle Cinder Creek had for sale, the father and 2 sons from a property 2 counties east. They were looking at the eastern pasture when the older son, who was maybe 20, looked at the valley and the creek and the layout of the operation and said to Callum, with the direct curiosity of someone who hadn't learned yet to pretend he knew things he didn't, "How'd you build something like this starting from nothing?" Callum looked at the pasture, at the creek, at the barn that had been reinforced twice now and stood straight in the way things stand straight when they've been built to last, rather than to look built. At the fence line running east to where the resurrected boundary marker stood in the ground, a plain stone, nothing written on it, just the location itself as the whole statement. Rosalind was across the yard, talking to the father about the cattle, and even at that distance, Callum could hear the precision in her voice. The drainage percentages, the rotation schedule, the weight gains across the last 2 seasons. Information delivered with the confidence of someone who had measured everything twice and trusted the measurements. "I didn't start from nothing," Callum said. "I started from 15 years of wages and one decision about what they were for." He paused. "And then someone came through the gate and told me I was building a fence corner wrong, and I fixed it." The young man looked at the corner post. He looked at Callum, trying to figure out if the answer was supposed to be more than that. It wasn't supposed to be more than that. That was the whole of it. The 15 years, and the decision, and the person who came through the gate with better information than he had and stayed because the work was worth staying for. The cattle sold at a fair price. The family from 2 counties east went home with what they'd come for. The day finished itself out in the ordinary way of good days on a working ranch, with the light going long and gold across the eastern pasture, and the creek running clear in the cut of the valley and the smoke rising from the house where supper was on the stove. Callum latched the gate. He stood at it for a moment, the way he sometimes did, looking back at the property from the outside of it before going in for the night. It was a thing he'd done since the first week he owned the place, when he was still absorbing the reality of it. He still didn't fully understand why the view from the outside of the gate was different from the view from the inside. Something about perspective, something about knowing that the gate was yours to open or close. Rosalind came out of the house and stood on the porch and called that supper was ready. Her voice carried across the yard in the quiet evening air, and he turned and walked toward the house and the light in the window and the woman in the doorway who had arrived here once with her father's money and had left it at the gate and stayed for everything else. He had bought Cinder Creek because he was tired of living on land that belonged to other men. He had not known, when he signed that paper, that the thing he was most tired of was something he didn't yet have words for. The particular loneliness of building something that had no one to be built with. He knew it now. The door closed behind him, and the evening settled over the valley, and the creek ran in the dark, below the eastern pasture, and the fence stood where it was supposed to stand, exactly where the original deed had always said it stood, and the land was quiet, and it was his, and it was theirs, and those two things were, at last, the same thing. Horace Vane turned 62 in the fall of that first married year, and Rosalind made him a meal at Cinder Creek, because it was the first birthday since her mother died that he hadn't spent alone in the main house with the ledger books open and the evening going dark around him without anyone noticing. He arrived on time, which was characteristic, and he brought a bottle of good whiskey, which was also characteristic, and he sat at Callum's table. Their table now, Callum and Rosalind's table, and ate the meal and drank moderately and talked about cattle prices and the coming winter's outlook and the territorial legislature's position on grazing rights on federal land. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, he stopped talking about cattle and said, without particular segue, "Your mother would have been pleased." Rosalind looked at her plate for a moment. "I know." "She was always better than I was at seeing what a person was for," Horace said. He was looking at the table when he said it. "She saw it in you when you were small, told me you were going to run something someday, and I said, women don't run cattle operations in Montana, and she said that was a statement about Montana, not about you." He paused. She was right. She usually was. Callum refilled Horace's glass and said nothing, because this was not a conversation that needed him in it, and he understood when to be present without being in the way. Rosalind looked at her father. "Why didn't you ever let me in to the operation when I was old enough?" Horace was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid you'd be better at it than the men I employed, and then I'd have a problem I didn't know how to solve." He said it without defense, just the plain shape of it. "And because your mother's death left me, I didn't know what I was doing anymore for a while. I was just managing the surface of things and hoping that underneath held." "It held," Rosalind said. "Barely." He looked at his glass. "Then you came through that gate and found a man who did what I should have done from the beginning, which was to listen to you because you were right, and I understood what I'd been wasting." He looked up at Callum. "I told you once that I'd believed a poor man couldn't give her enough. I was measuring with the wrong instrument." "You said something like that," Callum said. "I meant it." Horace picked up his glass. "I still mean it, only differently." He looked at his daughter. "He gave you the operation, the one you were always supposed to be running." Rosalind held her father's gaze. Something between them resolved quietly in the way things resolve between people who have enough history together that some conversations happen mostly in the silences between the words. "Stay the night," she said. "It's too late to ride back." Horace looked at the window where the dark had come all the way down over the valley. "I suppose it is," he said. He stayed. He slept in the extra room on the same cot Rosalind had used through the winter, and in the morning he was up before either of them and the stove was going when Callum came out, and Horace was standing at the kitchen window looking at the eastern pasture in the early light. "Grass is holding well for October," he said, without turning. "Good rotation," Callum said. "Her system." Horace nodded. "I know." He turned from the window. "She explained it to me in July. Took about 20 minutes. It was 20 minutes I should have given her 10 years ago." He moved toward the door. "I'll check your south fence line while I'm here. I noticed 2 posts yesterday that looked like they needed attention. I know which ones I was going to get to them this week." "I'll get to them this morning," Horace said. He pulled on his coat. "Consider it rent for the room." He was outside before Callum could respond, which was probably deliberate. The winter of that second year was hard but manageable in the way that hard winters become manageable when you've planned for them, honestly, and haven't lied to yourself about the margins. The hay loft was full. The cattle came through the cold months in good condition. The water system held, both wells running clean through February, and by March the creek was already showing the first signs of the snowmelt flood that would run high for a week and then settle into the clear, fast current of spring. Garveth died that March. He died in his house on the South Road in his bed, of causes that the doctor described as general and age-related, which was the honest accounting for a man of 78 who had simply run down. A neighbor found him, and word reached Callum by the afternoon. He rode to town the next day to make the arrangements because Garveth had no family in the county and someone had to, and it was not a hardship to do it for a man who had sat at a table and handed over a signed statement and then ridden a train to Helena and sat in a witness chair and told the truth in a room full of people with financial reasons to prefer otherwise. He brought Garveth's surveying instrument back to Cinder Creek. He didn't know what else to do with it. Garveth had no heirs that could be located, and it seemed wrong to leave it in the house when the house was cleared. He set it on the shelf above the fireplace in the main room and has stayed there, and visitors sometimes asked about it and got the short version of the story, and the short version was always enough to understand what the instrument represented without needing all the detail. Rosalind wrote a letter to the County Historical Society about Garveth's career as a surveyor, the legitimate 40 years of it, the careful boundary work that had shaped roads and property lines and water access across Holt County. She didn't omit the 1877 arrangement. She described it as a failure of integrity under financial pressure by a man who spent 12 years attempting to account for it and ultimately did. The Historical Society included it in their records. It was not a flattering portrait in every detail. It was a true one. That, she decided, was the more durable thing to leave. The letter from Cord came in April of the third year, and it contained the final resolution of Crowell's case. He had been disbarred by the Territorial Bar Association, and the fraud charges had resolved through plea to a lesser count of misconduct, the incarceration suspended given his age and his cooperation. He had paid restitution, a modest amount relative to the actual damages, his attorney having negotiated vigorously on the point, and he had relocated to a city in the eastern states whose name Callum didn't recognize and made no effort to look up. Cord's letter noted this with her characteristic plainness and then spent the remainder of the page on a question about a water rights case in the next county that she thought might have implications for Cinder Creek's creek access agreement and wanted Callum's opinion on whether it was worth filing a protective claim as a precaution. He wrote back that it was probably worth filing and that he'd defer to her judgment on the mechanics, and that was the end of Lucian Crowell in the active life of Cinder Creek Ranch. He did not feel triumphant about it. He didn't feel much about it at all, which was perhaps the honest outcome. Not forgiveness, not satisfaction, just the way a wound stops demanding your attention once it's been properly treated and given enough time. Crowell had done damage. The damage had been addressed. The rest was Crowell's to live with, wherever he'd taken himself. That was sufficient. In the summer of the third year, Clara Haller came to Cinder Creek. She was the older of Ed Haller's two daughters, the one who lived in Great Falls, the one who had sent the letter to Horace. She came without announcement. A letter had arrived 2 weeks prior saying she intended to visit the property if that was acceptable, and Callum had written back that it was, and then she simply appeared one morning in July, a woman in her mid-40s with her father's broad hands and the kind of face that has absorbed a lot of weather and history and hasn't softened either. She stood at the gate. She looked at the property for a long time before she came through it. Rosalind met her in the yard. Callum stayed near the barn, giving them space. "I grew up here," Clara said, "until I was about 12. She looked at the barn. The barn was smaller. My father built half of that addition. She looked at the well. He dug that well himself. It took him the better part of 2 summers. "It runs clean," Rosalind said. "Both of them. We repaired the lining 2 years ago." Clara looked at her. "My father's name isn't on anything here. It's not in any record." "No," Rosalind said, "it isn't. That money your father sent." Clara paused. "It was fair, more than fair, for what the law required." She was quiet a moment. "It wasn't what I came about." "I know," Rosalind said. "What did you come about?" Clara looked at the eastern pasture, at the boundary marker that stood at the far edge, the plain stone, the nothing written on it. "I wanted to see that it was tended," she said, "that the land was being used for something. My father spent everything he had on this place, and then it got taken from him by a line that moved in the night, and he died believing it had been wasted." She paused. "I wanted to see that it wasn't wasted." Rosalind looked at the pasture, at the cattle in the eastern rotation, at the creek running clear through the valley. "It isn't wasted," she said. Clara looked at it for a long time. She nodded once, slowly, with the weight of a person closing a long account. Callum brought out coffee, which was the plainest practical thing he could offer, and they sat on the porch, the three of them, and Clara talked about her father, about the property as it had been, about the family that had lived here and what had become of each of them. Some of it was hard to hear. None of it was offered as accusation. It was simply the record, the account of what the moved boundary line had cost in human terms beyond the legal ones. The sale at a loss, the move east, the mother's declining health, the daughters growing up with the particular understanding that things could be taken and that knowing the right people was the mechanism by which they were taken. "My sister has children," Clara said. "2 boys. They're not going to grow up knowing that, not if I can help it." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "I am a school teacher in Great Falls. I teach them to read and write and do their sums, and I tell them what documents are for, what a signed paper means, what the county recorder's office is, and how it works." She looked at Callum, because that's the thing that saved this property. Someone knew what to do with what they found. "Someone knew the right people to tell," Callum said. "Same thing, sometimes." "Yes," he said, "sometimes." She left in the early afternoon, riding back toward town in the summer heat, and Callum and Rosalind stood at the gate and watched her go, and neither of them spoke for a while. "We should put his name on something," Rosalind said. Callum looked at her. "Ed Haller. He dug the well. He built part of the barn." She was looking at the well casing. "There should be something with his name on it." They made a small marker. Not a monument, nothing grandiose, just a flat piece of stone from the creek bottom with the name cut into it by the blacksmith in town, set near the well base where it wouldn't be in anyone's way but would be visible if you were looking. E. Haller, 1851 to 1884. He built this. That was all. It was enough. Clara wrote a letter when she heard about it, a short one. She said her father had been a man who took pride in his work and would have been glad to be remembered for the work specifically, rather than for what happened to the work afterward. She said she appreciated the marker more than the money, which she suspected Rosalind already understood. Rosalind did. In the spring of the 4th year, Rosalind's condition became evident to anyone paying attention, which Callum had been for about 6 weeks and had not yet fully assembled into words. She told him directly one evening, as she tended to do things, without preamble, in the middle of something else, the way the real information always arrived. She was doing the supply inventory and she looked up from the ledger and said, "There's going to be a 3rd person at this table by October." Callum set down what he was doing. She held his gaze with the particular expression she wore when she'd said a true thing and was waiting to see what came back. "October," he said. "October. Probably late." He crossed the room. She stood up from the table and he put both hands on her face the way he'd put them over her hands in the burned yard of Horace's ranch, and he held her face and looked at her and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't a shape of words that covered what they were looking at. "Well," she said finally. "Well," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the almost was enough, the same as it had always been. Horace, when he was told, was quiet for a full half-minute, which was longer than his usual processing time for significant information. Then he looked at Callum and said, with the simple directness that had gradually become his preferred register, "I'll fix the fence posts on the south line before winter. A proper job this time, not one morning's work." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Horace stood up from the table. "I want my grandchild to see a fence line that was built to last." He put on his coat. "That's not charity. That's arithmetic." Callum watched him go and thought that Horace Vane at 63 was a more legible man than Horace Vane at 60 had been. Not softer, not diminished, but clearer. The way a thing becomes clearer when you've stopped trying to hold more of it than your hands were built to hold. The child was a girl, born in November, 2 weeks late in the way that suggested from the very beginning that she had her own schedule and would be keeping it. They named her Marin, which had been Rosalind's mother's middle name, and she arrived into a house that was warm and solid and had been built up from almost nothing by hands that knew what they were for. She grew up knowing the land the way Rosalind had always hoped to know it. From the inside of the decisions, not the outside. She walked the fence lines when she was old enough to walk distances, and she learned the rotation system from her mother's explanations and her own observation. And she understood the creek and its moods and what the water level in October told you about the following spring before she could explain why she understood it. She grew up knowing the story of the sealed well, not as a family legend, not as a drama performed for her benefit, but as a factual account of what had happened on the property before she was born and what it had taken to correct it. She knew Garveth's name and what he had done wrong and what he had done right. She knew Clara Haller's name and could read the marker near the well and understand what it was for. She grew up knowing that things can be taken by people with more power than you, and that the answer to that is not to acquire more power by the same means, but to know what your documents say and where your boundary markers stand, and who in the county recorder's office can be trusted, and what an appeal to a territorial court requires, and what an honest attorney costs, and whether the cost is worth it. It is always worth it. That was the lesson Cinder Creek had been built on, without Callum ever stating it as a lesson. The fence corners done right, the well maintained, the boundary confirmed and documented and set in stone, literally, at the eastern edge of the eastern pasture where it had always belonged. Some mornings Callum still stood at the gate before going in, the way he had since the first week he owned the place. Looking at the property from the outside of it, letting the outside view confirm what the inside felt like. The barn straight and weathered and real, the south fence running true, the two wells both working, the creek in the valley bottom, the same creek, the same water, running where it had always run. He had bought this land because he was tired of living on land that belonged to other men. He had not known at the time that what he was actually buying was the possibility of something he didn't yet have words for. A life that fit the shape of who he actually was, rather than the shape of what other people's land required him to be. It had taken a fence corner built wrong and a woman who told him so to get to the rest of it. He latched the gate, same as always, walked toward the house, same as always. The light was in the window and the smoke was rising from the chimney, and somewhere inside, the sounds of an ordinary evening. His daughter's voice, his wife's answer, the stove doing its work, the supper getting toward ready. He put his hand on the door. The land was behind him, and it was his, and it was right, and it would still be there in the morning, and that was the whole of the dream he'd carried in a tobacco tin under other men's bunks for 15 years, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and Callum Rourke opened the door and went inside.